One night, a final-year university student, on her way home through the streets of Night City. She was hit and killed by a car in a crosswalk. She was a student who constantly criticized the professors, so, in their opinion, her death seemed unfair. However, she later returned to life and found herself transported to a fictional world. That of a novel she had read the night before her accident. To her horror, she was reincarnated into the body of a villain named Searia, doomed to a terrible death at the end of the story. If she didn't act, she would end up sitting on the floor, in front of the two protagonists. Then, one of them would draw his sword and punish her with a single blow for all her sins. At that moment, after being there for a while, the protagonist sat down at the table, listening to how the Empire would now have a glorious future. That's what the temple priestess believed, seeing the saint descended from heaven, a sign of a divine blessing. The saint turned out to be a young woman whom her fiancé, Kali's, quickly ran to, taking off his jacket to cover her. Seeing them so charming, the priestess concluded that they were already very close and that Miss Searia must be jealous. Clenching her fist, the protagonist got angry, as her wedding with Kali's was only a week away. Seeing him smile and flirt with the saint, she wanted to approach and tickle his head. However, preferring not to act in front of strangers, she only laughed with a hand over her mouth. And she considered her husband too effusive. Suddenly, the Imperial Archduke Georg Rocheberg appeared on the balcony, looking at her sternly. He thought that if Searia remained there, she might catch a cold, and her insistent fiancé. No doubt he would make a scene. The hero did not want to tolerate scandals in his house, so he wished for the saint to be escorted to the Supreme Church as soon as possible. Looking at him, Searia knew that, even if it seemed unpleasant, the day would come when the hero would love the saint. That same fate awaited at the end of the story Lardsduke, who was also the main hero. Now everyone was a character, in a romance about a heroine who jumps between dimensions. Called Lena, she was the saint who, upon arriving in this world, became the object of love for two main heroes, Callies and Rush. Searia was a villain, whose body the main heroine occupied and who faced a terrible death. Furthermore, Searia inherited the strength of the gods and obtained the title of Stern. She could have been the holiest creature in the Empire, but her bad nature drove her to commit dishonest acts. Unlike her relationships with her family, which became extremely repulsive, Searia thrived on extravagance. The heroine was in complete despair, not wanting to die and not understanding why. Of all the characters, it was precisely Searia she got stuck with. She thought that before Lena appeared in her life, she had to find a way to get rid of all her enemies. The girl actively started asking for forgiveness from everyone Searia had been rude to. She also began generously giving expensive gifts to other ladies and even the maids. Later, collecting herbs from the rocks behind the church, the heroine began to use them to heal Kali's wounded hand, leaving him stunned. Until recently, she had behaved proudly and arrogantly towards him, but now she went alone to the rocks, which was dangerous. However, Serena had a strong motivation, as Kali's was the one who would kill her. So she had to find something that would please him. The hero's surprise gave way to embarrassment, and he wanted to know what had made her change so much. At that moment, by sheer chance, the second protagonist fell in love with Serena. Later, they spent a lot of time together, walking and chatting, while Kali's feelings grew. This went on until one day, the hero knelt before her and proposed marriage. In the original story, Rush and Lena were supposed to fall in love with each other. Meanwhile, Kali's, desperate, committed suicide, so Serena considered this twist even better. The young woman was intrigued as to whether, without her intervention, a love would arise between Kali's and Lena. But now she had made a promise and was counting on not ending up in a love triangle. Now, seeing how her fiancé beamed with happiness while talking to the saint, she understood that Lena would soon approach the Archduke. Although Serena's promise was clearly stated, the saint soon approached her. Lena introduced herself, convinced that she had dreamed of meeting Kali's fiancé. The protagonist responded with a smile. She didn't wish to start any relationship with her and didn't understand what was happening. Upon introduction, Lena smiled and admitted she felt very awkward about being called saint. It turned out the reason for her visit was that she had heard about Serena's intention to try on a wedding dress. Lena dreamed of seeing a wedding dress from another world, burning with curiosity. The protagonist was slightly annoyed that the saint used her husband's name. Even for Searia, carrying it out took a whole 11 months. Suddenly, Lena felt a strong desire to see how the girl would try on the wedding dress. Surprised by such a desire, Searia didn't understand if the saint wanted to see her undressed. But at that very moment, the dressmaker Begonia appeared, who considered that trying on a wedding dress was not a spectacle at all. Furthermore, the privilege of attending fittings is only granted to the bride's guests, close relatives and best friends. Looking disapprovingly at the saint, the woman decided she did not belong to any of the mentioned types. Upset by her words, Lena decided she still hadn't gotten used to the customs of this world. At that moment, Searia remembered that Begonia had also been a villain in the original story. Eventually, a dismissal awaited her for treating the saint cruelly. Hurt by the dressmaker's words, tears sprang from Lena's eyes, and she hurried to say goodbye to Searia. Suddenly, the protagonist realized that a moment from the book had just occurred. She decided that, no matter what, the course of the other events must necessarily change. In time, sitting at a table opposite his fiancée, Collies suddenly decided to dismiss Begonia. He believed that Saint Lena had been sent by the heavens. And of course, she was completely different from corrupt aristocrats. If the tailor didn't understand this and dared to speak to her so rudely, it was best to fire her. Searia defended Begonia, who had only reprimanded Lena for her lack of courtesy. Collies responded by justifying himself and covering for her, calling her by her name. Hearing this, Searia was indignant to see him call her only by her first name in front of his fiancée. The hero admitted his mistake and apologized, but his attitude towards the tailor was because he was the saint's protector. The girl knew that, in the original story, Lena's divine power had become extremely unstable after arriving in this world. The high church authorities chose a protector from among the heads of the 17 clans possessing divine power. That responsibility fell to the head of House Hanet, which was Collies. Under those circumstances, it was natural for him and Lena to become so close, but Searia did not expect it. Since they had been trained, the hero thought his fiancée was worried that he hadn't informed her about his designation as protector. Looking at him, the girl decided that perhaps she had acted too arrogantly. If she got angry now, everything could end as badly as in the original story. To avoid that fate, she pretended to understand Collies' feelings. The hero rushed to her, relieved that, contrary to his expectations, she hadn't been offended. Calling her his love, he whispered sweet words of thanks for her understanding in her ear. At that moment, Searia understood that this kind of love was not what she needed at all. Some time later, the hero abandoned her again to visit Lin, whose divine power, supposedly, had gotten out of control. Since he spoke her name, not a day went by without them meeting, which deeply angered Searia. Now she understood why she was the villain in the original story. How could she be good under such circumstances? One day, the commander of the Burkov household knights, Elliot, approached her on the street. Thinking she looked unwell. He had already heard she was suffering from a cold, and it seemed Searia had exhausted herself too much during today's inspection of the glacier. It was an unusual accumulation of ice, known as the Monster's Tomb, located on the Burkov household's grounds. To prevent creatures from appearing, the Burkov family periodically checked the shield in that location. For this, the divine strength possessed by the Sterns was necessary, and Searia was one of them. In the original plot, the protagonist always postponed her visits to the lake. However, if she wanted to solidify her position and survive there, she had to fulfill her duties well. Deciding that was enough for the day, Elliot suggested returning. Suddenly, the Duke appeared, who called Searia from afar and walked towards them. Upon approaching, he demanded an explanation for what she was doing there. Seeing his threatening appearance, Searia wondered, perplexed, if she had done something wrong. However, the hero wanted to know why she had gone to the lagoon in this weather, without staying to recover from the flu. The heroine thanked him for his concern, but she already felt better, and coming here was her duty as an external. The Duke was intrigued since when she started taking her obligations seriously. He thought perhaps Searia was trying to weaken herself to attract her fiancé's attention. The young woman was shocked by the assumption, but restraining her emotions, concluded that she had no personal reason to come. Moreover, regardless of her condition, her fiancé would not cause alarm in the Archduke's palace. Then, Rutsch concluded that perhaps it was all due to the recently proclaimed saint. He supposed that perhaps Marquis Colles was having an affair with her, which left Searia stunned. The heroine was shocked, not understanding how he could say that to her face. Receiving no answer, Rutsch decided to ask if they had finished the inspection. It turned out everything was done, and thanks to Searia's work, they had resolved it quite quickly. At that moment, the young woman looked indignantly at the Archduke, considering him extremely arrogant. Certainly, he was the protagonist, and quite attractive too. But why make him so unpleasant? Suddenly, not wanting the health of the valued external to worsen, Rutsch ordered an immediate return. The protagonist was stunned. She didn't understand why he had been so kind after his harsh comments. Later, she wondered if perhaps he liked her more than he appeared at first glance. Still, it was worth avoiding Rutsch, as he had something scary, especially in his way of speaking. Now, Searia wished the wedding would take place as soon as possible, so she could leave that place. There was only one reason why she had to stay at House Burkov. The Sterns in the Empire are considered saints, which is why they are allowed to participate in important rituals. Therefore, as a Stern, the protagonist helps House Burkov protect the frozen lake. Searia did everything possible to prevent the wedding from taking place there. The reason was that the two protagonists, Lena and Rutsch, who were supposed to marry at the end of the story, were there. Furthermore, it would turn out at the end that the saint was also a Stern, which would drive everyone crazy. The protagonist understood why the original Searia envied Lena, because being a saint and a Stern at the same time was too much. However, that would only be discovered at the end. And until then, the protagonist wanted to get married and get out of there. Suddenly, a female voice called her. It was Searia's fellow knight, Abigail Orion. The woman immediately greeted her and asked how the expedition against the monsters had gone, and if everyone had returned safe and sound. It turned out everything went well, although Abby missed her mistress when her armor got cold as ice. The equipment in this world is made of constellation steel, which protects its wearer well from magical poisoning. But without the help of the Sterns, prolonged contact with the body will cause the star armor to drain heat. Smiling, Abby threw her cape over Searia, determined to get inside quickly before she caught a chill. The heroine thought that, like Rutsch, the knight was concerned about her because she was a Stern. Determined to reinforce her faith in her usefulness, the girl invited Abby to the mansion to learn everything that had happened to her. Meanwhile, Lena stayed by the window, watching the heroine attentively. She wondered why Kali's fiancé visited the glacier every day. She learned from a servant that Searia was a Stern, and only they could purify the lake barrier. Recently, the heroine even received a reward from the palace for diligently carrying out her duties. After reflecting on what she heard and following the gaze towards the girl, Lena understood that she envied her and wished to be a Stern too. The servant was very perplexed and looked without understanding at the young woman, who was already considered a saint. However, for Lena, Stern sounded better than saint, and they also received more attention. Laughing, the servant recalled that there would soon be a lavish banquet in honor of the saint and first, she had to learn good manners. Furthermore, anyone could be a Stern. It was determined at birth, and Lena definitively confirmed that she envied Searia. Shortly after, while the heroine was in bed, the maid reminded her of her impending birthday. Searia felt grateful because, absorbed in her business, she had completely forgotten that she was born on a Wednesday in winter. That was one of the requirements to become a Stern. Those born on Monday were beautiful. Tuesdays were compassionate. Those born on Wednesday carried a deep sadness. Thursdays were full of love. And Fridays were kind and gentle. The protagonist understood that it was very unfair to those born on Wednesday. The original Searia also thought so, but upon becoming a stern, she immediately loved her birthday. Upon awakening her powers at age 15, she used the title as a new surname, distancing herself from her family, which worsened their relationship. Furthermore, according to the maid, the saint remained interested in constellation steel, which caused concern. Searia was intrigued whether approaching the steel would be dangerous for Lena, while her power was unstable. However, the maid considered the saint very curious, and the girl thought it was a typical protagonist quality. However, in the original story, Lena became a stern precisely after touching the constellation steel. Searia decided not to worry, as she planned to move to the Hennet house after the wedding and live there in peace. A little later, while collecting silver laurel branches, the girl couldn't stop marveling as she looked at them. She was sure that if stern could be a plant, it would surely look like this. These silver laurels, with purification power, were used by the knights as a substitute for stern when she was away. Also with their help, Searia performed the lake purification, and while heading there, she ran into Rush. She bowed to the Archduke as a greeting, but accidentally dropped all the silver branches. Blushing with embarrassment, she immediately knelt down and began picking them up. To her surprise, Rush also bent down and began helping her, surprised that the protagonist returned to the lake. As far as the protagonist knew, she was constantly attended to in her chambers, but wasn't that enough for her? This question left Searia perplexed, and she looked at Rush in bewilderment, not understanding where he was going with that. The Archduke also thought that it was almost unnecessary for the protagonist to check the glacier so frequently. Wasn't the previous time because she needed something? Before, every time she came to his palace, Searia would scream if something displeased her. Moreover, more than 100 servants ended up tied to the bed after attending to her. Mentally cursing the original protagonist, the young woman decided she now had to work harder to compensate for the damage caused. With a smile, the Archduke found her extremely mysterious and was saddened that she would be leaving for the Hennet house. Hearing these words, the protagonist stood still in surprise, looking at Rouge with astonishment. Later, sitting in her room drinking tea, she remembered and assimilated those words again. Meanwhile, her wedding gifts arrived, which greatly excited the maids. However, the young woman was completely absorbed in the fact that the Archduke was saddened to see her leave. For those words filled her with confidence and strength. Determined to focus on the wedding, Searia took the crystal bracelet she had prepared earlier. She decided to give it to Collies as a token of gratitude for everything he had done for her. In the original story, Lena will discover a crystal mine. Until then, they would be considered precious stones. Suddenly, a maid burst into the room, shouting that a tragedy had occurred. It turned out that Miss Lena had lost consciousness upon touching the constellation steel monument. Moreover, the monument itself turned transparent and shone, surprising everyone even more. Stupefied, Searia realized this meant the appearance of a new stern. Upon arriving at the room where Lena lay, the protagonist froze, considering it impossible, as they were only at the beginning of the story. With her, Rush ran there quickly, eager to know the saint's condition. According to the servants, the worst was over, and Her Holiness had the luck to have Marquis Collies Hennet nearby. At that moment, the Marquis was sitting by the bed, holding Lena's hand. And he didn't even notice his fiancée's arrival. The Archduke observed Searia's disheartened look, as servants informed him about the appearance of a new stern. He wondered if, upon waking, the protagonist had also suffered so much. However, this was not the case, since Searia's divine power was much less than Lena's. The Archduke understood that the saint could not ignore that her divine power overwhelmed her. From this, he concluded that Lena had intentionally touched the constellation steel, thus causing a scandal in his palace. Others doubted, thinking that the girl surely didn't know she was a stern, and simply touched the monument. Seeing the servant who served the saint, Rush wanted to know from him why Lena acted that way. Becoming confused, the servant thought it might be because the saint admired Sarai. Hearing this, the heroine was in shock and wondered if it was possible, or if Lena just wanted to check if she could become a stern. In the book it happened accidentally, and the saint's explosion of divine power almost killed the girl, revealing her true essence. While the heroine analyzed what happened, Rausch's main aide, Burke Lennon, reported on the saint's awakening. The hero expected his master to at least look at Lena, but the archbishop, upon learning of her awakening, simply decided to leave. Lennon tried to stop him, but Rausch responded by asking if he really looked like his caregiver. The aide begged him to stay, at least to maintain good relations with the first priest. Finally yielding to his pleas, the archbishop agreed and proposed that Searia visit the new external together. Meanwhile, seeing Lena open her eyes, Kali's desperately called her name. Regaining consciousness, the girl tried to look at the Marquis for a moment through her blurred vision, while Kali's constantly comforted her, promising her that everything would be fine. Rush stared fixedly at Searia. He then turned to the priest, deciding that this winter season, his home was truly full of events. Pointing his hand at the saint, the archducal judge decided he had no intention of keeping this burden here any longer. Hearing this, Searia couldn't believe it and looked at Rush in surprise. Rush immediately wished for his aide to immediately write to the high church, and that, as soon as Lena could walk, she should return there. Kali's couldn't stand it and shouted indignantly at the archducal judge, as the girl didn't plan to get sick. According to the Marquis, calling a sick person a burden was inhumane. Smiling, Rush wondered if he couldn't express himself as he wished in his own house. However, Kali's considered those words too rude, as the saint was by no means disabled. In response, the archducal judge coldly commented that the Marquis's relationship with his fiancée couldn't be called healthy either. It surprised him that Kali's didn't realize his priorities had shifted slightly. Seeing this, people might think that his fiancée was precisely the saint, and after those words, the Marquis looked at Searia in confusion. At that moment, the protagonist felt an inexplicable bitterness, thinking she should be angry with the Marquis, not with Rush. Until then, she never showed anger and endured everything firmly to avoid the fate of the book series. The archducal judge thought it had been a long time since Esther's wedding was held, and that the promise he made to her should be kept like a sacred relic. Sitting down very humiliated, the protagonist wished to return home and live in peace. Suddenly, Rush held out his hand, wishing to leave the room with Searia. Seeing the young woman's confusion, he decided that the saint needed rest and that they should leave as soon as possible. Seeing this, Kali's immediately distracted himself from Lena, looked at the heroine, and held out his hand to her. But at that moment, the saint started coughing, and the Marquis instantly forgot his fiancée, turning towards her. After that, the Archduke took Searia's hand, wishing to confirm if she agreed to leave. The heroine nodded obediently, and as she walked away holding his hand, she heard Kali's start taking care of the saint behind her. The next day, while collecting silver laurel branches in the cellars, Searia remembered how her desperate fiancé was comforting the saint. She, being his fiancé, did not receive a single word from the Marquis directed at her. Suddenly, Rush appeared in the cellar, surprising the young woman. Recalling how he had taken her out of Lena's room the day before, Searia realized she still hadn't thanked him. The Archduke was intrigued as to whether the heroine could properly inspect the barrier after what happened yesterday. He figured that if the girl was doing it as an excuse to get out of there, why not just settle in the annex? However, Searia felt she had no reason to worry, as she had to fulfill her duties with the same dedication as always. Smiling, the heroine thought she would never refuse to fulfill her duty as an external. Rush wanted to clarify that he wasn't referring to that, but suddenly, a male voice was heard behind him. It turned out to be Marquis Hennet, who hadn't been able to find his fiancée anywhere, and he was surprised to see her there. With a smile, Rush turned to him and was surprised to see that Kali's seemed not to have noticed him at all. The Marquis apologized for his rudeness, admitting that he had spent the whole day searching for his fiancée. Glancing at Searia, he hadn't expected to find both of them in such an isolated place. Kali's tried to invite her with him, but Rush didn't let him finish upon seeing the heroine's disappointed expression. Looking severely at the Marquis, the Archduke felt offended by his arrival here without permission. Rush was surprised to discover that collies didn't know that one could only enter the storeroom with the personal permission of the head of the house. Smiling as a response, the Marquis decided that upon returning to his lands, he would gladly repay the debt. However, if the Archduke already had a specific amount, he could name it right now. And Collies was ready to send the request. But Rush considered that the hero had no right to choose his own punishment, which would be determined according to the tradition of House Burkov. According to tradition, the culprit must have one of their hands cut off at choice. Looking furiously at Rush, Collies thought he wanted to start a war between their houses. But according to the Archduke, the hero brought it upon himself. Searia watched him stunned, wondering if they were really going to declare a war in winter to check who was braver. Rush believed that if the Marquis sought a war, House Burkov would gladly accept his challenge. But Collies was firmly convinced that between the two, only the Archduke sought war. Upon hearing that the Marquis was going to send a military telegram to his house, the heroine couldn't take it anymore. And she ran towards both of them. Approaching Rusk, she thought that although her fiancé had shown disrespect, there was no reason to start a war over such a trivial matter. Moreover, it would be cruel to the knights who were already busy taking care of the ice storage in winter. Grabbing the edge of the Archduke's clothing, she began to beg him to show the Marquis the benevolence he had already shown her. In response, he decided that Collies would swear never to do anything so disrespectful again. Without answering her, Rusk walked away, considering that the Marquis had the most beautiful fiancée. Realizing the danger had passed, the heroine exclaimed with joy, which further confused Collies. Approaching his fiancée, the hero wanted to talk to her immediately. Searia didn't want to talk to him at all, but the Marquis wouldn't give up, considering her impertinent and inappropriate behavior. What especially caught his attention was that she held the Archduke's clothing, and Collies thought he had been motivated by simple anger. At that moment, Searia couldn't hold back anymore and decided to clarify if he really thought her behavior was rude. Understanding where she was going, the hero began to defend himself, claiming that Lena was sick and, besides him, there was no one else she depended on at that moment. And why, knowing this, was his fiancée indignant, spending time with another man, and avoiding looking him in the eye? Of course, the Marquis himself behaved exactly the same way, but he considered it completely different. Justifying himself with the saint's supposed illness, the heroine also considered it different. At least he didn't call the Archduke by his first name in front of him. Deciding that she simply had to listen to him, Collies took his fiancée's hand, after which she wanted him to let go. But the hero did not want to let go, so she sharply pulled her hand away, freeing herself from his grip, and hit her arm against the trunk of a tree. From the impact, her entire hand bled, and tears sprang from her eyes, filled with resentment and indignation. Collies was surprised by what happened, thinking, "How can you tear your hand away like that?" In response, Searia decided that she would have broken off her engagement instead and asked for the saint's hand. The Marquis was perplexed, not understanding what she was saying, since the protagonist was his love. But the protagonist didn't understand. Who would believe a man who gently holds another woman's hand in front of their eyes? Although she liked him, unlike the original series, she was not head over heels in love with Collies. In the original series, the Marquis killed Searia, and then took his own life when rejected by Lena. The same fate awaited Searia and the Marquis. But if the protagonists were already set up for a happy ending, wouldn't it be fair for them to find one too? Fearing that both might die again, the protagonist believed he simply didn't understand anything. Collies couldn't even imagine how terrified Searia felt every time she saw him together with her. And Lena. The Marquis absolutely did not want to make her cry, so upon seeing his fiancée's tears, he immediately tried to comfort her. Hugging her, he decided that in the whole situation, he himself was the only one to blame. Now, the Marquis wanted to take her to his estate as soon as the wedding was over. He also decided that once the saint recovered, he would have no more contact with her. Standing in that place and holding his fiancée's hands, he promised to be a faithful husband. The protagonist decided to trust him this time, as it was the simplest method to avoid death. She wanted him not to be late for the wedding, but Kali's saw no reason to worry. Some time later, the Marquis entered Lena's room and confessed that this was the last day they could call each other by their first names. Bowing her head sadly, the young woman assumed it had to do with his fiancé. Agreeing with her, Kali's decided that after the wedding, they would also have difficulty seeing the saint. The girl was shocked and disheartened by those words, as she considered the Marquis her dear friend. Thinking it would be great to see each other occasionally, she suddenly noticed the bracelet on her wrist. The protagonist admired her perceptiveness, recognizing it was a gift from Searia. Lena wished to be friends with her, but Kali's knew that by protocol they had to call each other by their surnames. Suddenly, the saint began to rebel and shout, saying that this protocol had worn her out. She believed the protagonist was very unfair to her, not understanding how much she had to restrain herself. Furthermore, by order of the archbishop, she would soon have to return to the high church. And Lena didn't want to lose a friend like the Marquis. Lena was surprised that he didn't consider how often her world changed, and still decided to always protect her. It turned out those words were a lie, and the girl had been very happy hearing them. Recalling that she was from another world, Kals thought that many things must frighten her. Moreover, she was sick right now. He decided he must stay by her side at least at this moment. The Marquis tried to calm his holiness. Suddenly, Lena expressed a desire to go to the glacier, which greatly surprised the hero. But now that she was the stern, His Holiness wanted to help Searia and thus hoped to improve their relationship. Kals understood her feelings, but in the girl's current condition, it was extremely dangerous. However, Lena didn't want to hear objections and decided to go there even if alone. Accepting her insistence, the Marquis knew that His Holiness was still under the protection of House Hennet. And if anything happened to her, the Marquis's family would not fare well. So he decided to accompany her. As he walked with Lena towards the exit, he mentally promised Searia that this would be the last time. A little later, Lenin reported to the Archduke that Kales and Lena had left the palace. And that communication with the Marquis was completely lost. Rush became furious, wondering if the hero wanted Searia to die. According to the assistant, a blizzard might have surprised them, and they had simply gotten lost. But that was no reason to endanger Searia's life. Rush knew that, when it came to the Sterns' wedding, it was not something to be taken lightly. Because if all the conditions related to time, place, and other rules were not met, the Sterns' power would unleash and Searia could die. Of course, the Marquis understood this perfectly, and also the danger inherent in the Sterns' wedding. Recalling that at that moment, he should have given him a beating, Rush suddenly saw Searia through the window. The girl was in the middle of the search party, preparing to leave after Kales. And Lena. Lenin thought perhaps she was worried about her fiancé and wished to accompany them. The Archduke observed that in the last year she had completely changed and didn't understand if it was because of love. Considering her busy, he issued a decree forbidding Searia from leaving the palace. Some time later, in her room looking out the window, the heroine decided she had to find her fiancé. Despite the ban, suddenly, Abby entered to inform the lady about the progress of the search party. It turned out that due to the blizzard, they decided to suspend the search today and resume it tomorrow at dawn. Searia was very desolate not to have found Kales, but the night brought her other news. That message the Archduke himself wished to convey, which left the heroine perplexed. Rush decided he would drag that scoundrel to the wedding hall, even if he had to tie him up, and throw him there personally. And if by the day of the ceremony, Searia received no news from him, she should continue preparing as if nothing had happened. Abby recalled that when the Archduke conveyed those words to her, he was very angry. The heroine knew that the church constantly insisted on punctuality, but she didn't understand exactly why. Now, Rush decided to personally join the search, and Searia had no doubt that Kales would return. On the day of the ceremony, being with the hero in a forest cabin, Lena feared he would leave her there alone. But the Marquis hurried his pace, remembering that very little time remained for the ceremony. The saint didn't understand why not postpone it for a day or two, since Kales wouldn't make it in time anyway. However, the Marquis knew it was impossible, and that, when it came to Esterna's wedding, nothing could be postponed. Lena screamed desperately, wishing the hero would explain everything to her. But suddenly, blood came out of the Marquis's mouth, and then she understood that the wedding had already begun. Meanwhile, Searia walked towards the wedding altar, hearing the perplexed murmuring around. Due to Kali's absence, the guests didn't understand when the Marquis planned to appear, as he surely knew the consequences of not doing so. Upon learning that the heroine's divine power could explode, Evie became enraged. Suddenly, the heroine's eyes clouded over, and she felt her legs gradually losing balance. Falling to the ground, she started coughing up blood, not understanding what was happening. Evie tried to run to her, but the guests stopped her, as it was dangerous. It was Esterna's wedding, and if anyone other than the groom touched her, her divine power became even more overwhelming. Other guests started to talk about Juan R., while the priests decided to gather all of Sterna's symbolism to contain her power. At that moment, the heroine understood that, by trying to avoid a bad ending, she had ended up facing death anyway. Although originally a villain, Searia now did everything possible to be someone else, desiring only love. But was everything in vain? Not understanding what she had done wrong, the young woman heard the hall doors open. And Rush entered. Rushing quickly towards the protagonist, he knew that if he didn't act, everyone present would die. Lifting her in his arms, he decided that she could not die. Would it be fair to perish like this? Looking into his eyes with tears, the protagonist felt that such a death was very sad. She immediately lost consciousness, and her hand slowly fell to the floor. At that very moment, the Archduke ordered the preparation of the wedding ceremony to begin. Surprising the priests, Ruch decided that Stern's wedding must take place as planned, and Searia would surely be saved. Finding herself in complete darkness, the protagonist ran terrified from an invisible pursuer towards the voice calling her. Suddenly, she opened her eyes, crying from fear and looking at Ruch in confusion. Wiping a tear from her cheek, the Archduke thought that Her Highness remained beyond his comprehension. What kind of terrible nightmare must it have been to bring Searia to tears? Looking at the ceiling, she realized she was in his room, and that the voice calling her in her dream belonged to Rush. Smiling ironically, the young woman admitted that in that horrible nightmare she died. The Archduke was intrigued as to whether she perhaps feared death. But according to Searia, everyone is afraid to die. After laughing, Rush recalled that after the protagonist's scandals, he decided that death was no longer scary to him. Suddenly, the young woman became interested in knowing what finally happened to Kali's. Thinking she had amnesia, the Archduke began to gently touch the damp bandage on Sirius's forehead. Did she really not remember what happened during the ceremony? About how, in front of the priest, Rush swore to Sirius Stern, possessor of the constellation's blessing. Realizing that she and the Archduke were now married, the protagonist froze. However, according to him, the head of House Burkov could not allow his lineage to be disgraced by the loss of Stern. Sirius understood that in that case, he already knew that she could die before the ceremony. She discovered that Stern's wedding had to be celebrated with strict protocol and to avoid the worst-case scenario. They were not told. However, they always notify their fiancés in advance, as they would also be in danger if the ceremony were interrupted. Deducing that the Marquis knew she would die if he was late, Sirius's eyes clouded with horror. After some time, despite the Archduke's veto and the servants' protests, Kali's burst into the young woman's chambers. Greeting him with a cold look, the protagonist decided the maid should leave them alone to talk. Grabbing Sirius by the shoulder, the hero didn't understand how she could have married another. In Rush on top of that. At that very moment, the protagonist delivered a sharp slap, leaving the Marquis's cheek very red. According to the young woman, he didn't attend the wedding. That's why he felt guilty that she married someone else. If it weren't for the Archduke, Searia would have faced a painful death caused by Kali's. Judging by his expression, the Marquis was unaware of her knowledge and didn't know what to say, as he knew he could ruin her. But perhaps he was looking for it, that's why he went to have fun with Lena. Kneeling before her, the Marquis hoped for understanding, as the storm left him no other option. He was terribly worried about his fiancée and even tried to reach her during the storm. But he suddenly lost consciousness. Searia was the only woman Kali's wanted to marry, and every word he said came from the heart. The hero took her hand, and at that moment, she felt a strange energy emanating from him. She suddenly understood that Kali's should not be alive, as his powers should have erupted. Like hers for breaking the oath. At that instant, she remembered that he had sworn to marry a stern, but theoretically, it didn't have to be her. Searia understood that the Marquis was in a situation where all the conditions for marriage were met. And since there was another stern in those domains, she deduced that the hero married Lena. It was the only logical explanation for why Kali's was still alive. She decided not to humiliate herself so much as to repeat the fate of the book's hero, and regretted the lost time. The Marquis became angry, considering it a temporary marriage, like his with the Archduke. Necessary for survival. But Sari didn't care, and she knew that by trying to avoid death, the submissive behavior of a fiancé had been her downfall. Kali's was willing to divorce them and finally marry each other, starting anew. While there was still time. Hearing this, Sari was very surprised. Was everything about the time? From that moment on, her feelings for Kali's completely disappeared without a trace. After that, she walked away down the hallway, while the Marquis followed her, wishing to talk to her. Seeing that she didn't react to his pleas, the protagonist abruptly grabbed her bandaged hand. At that instant, the protagonist again felt the strength of another stern emanating from him, which deeply disgusted her. She wanted the Marquis to let go of her immediately, but he kept holding her hand tightly. When suddenly the Archduke appeared. He heard him ask Kali's to let her go and thought that, on top of everything, the Marquis had probably lost his hearing. Looking furiously at Rush, Kali's reluctantly let go of the girl's hand, after which her wound reopened. The Archduke immediately offered to accompany Sari to the priest for assistance. At that moment, placing his hand on his heart, the Marquis decided that he himself could take the girl to the priest. Smiling, Rush decided that, in that case, the protagonist would choose for herself who to go with. Seeing how Sari unhesitatingly clung to the Archduke's hand, the Marquis was stunned. Beaming with joy, the protagonist smiled and felt she owed Rush. As he walked away from her side, the Archduke thought those words were unnecessary between spouses. Kali's remained in place, watching them with a jealous look while growling with silent anger. After healing her hand, the priest advised her to stay away from any intense movement for now. Rush asked if the protagonist felt better, but Zira did not answer, looking at her husband with surprised eyes. Then she immediately stood up and bowed to him, thanking him for saving her. Upon thinking that perhaps she had hit her head, Rush didn't understand why she did it. However, nothing was wrong with Zira, and on the contrary, she felt enlightened. She knew she owed her life to the protagonist, someone she had previously considered the most terrifying in the world. However, despite the false judgment, he celebrated his first marriage to save her. Now, Zira wanted to do everything possible to return the kindness shown to her. Furthermore, Zira wished that he wouldn't worry, as she didn't plan to hinder his marital options. The Archduke was surprised to see him worrying about such matters, while she was already preparing for him to marry 3 more times. She would be willing to employ all her strength for the good of Rush's lands for the entire duration of their marriage. What surprised the Archduke the most was the protagonist's alert gaze, as if she were afraid of him. But regardless, he now eagerly awaited her contribution to the well-being of House Burkov. After some time, Searia headed to the Burkov household prison, where her companion Abby was incarcerated. The knight didn't understand how her mistress had discovered she was there. But for the protagonist, that didn't matter now. The young woman was intrigued by what had prompted the warrior to challenge Kali's knights. Abby herself believed she had only challenged to a duel, but Searia knew they had taken it as an insult. Upon hearing that the knight even held back from challenging the Marquis himself, the protagonist clutched her head in despair. Elliot, who arrived at that moment, considered that Abigail had not challenged a chivalric duel. It rather looked like a fierce fight. Seeing him, Abby immediately became furious at his words, while the hero remembered that the warrior had barely avoided being expelled. However, there was no reason to worry, as thanks to the Archduke's grace, she would be released in a few days. Searia didn't know how to thank her for so much kindness, but according to Elliot, the one who owed the debt was Abigail. Later, upon returning with him to the palace, she thought the prison was too cold, and that Sayabai was freezing to death. But for the hero, she was one of those people who would find a way out, even if they were in an icy cave. Searia decided that as soon as her companion was released, she would feed her hot soup and wrap her in a warm coat. Laughing, Elliot now understood why the Archduke was so interested in the mistress. Very blushful, and recalling all her conversations with Rush, the protagonist could hardly believe he found her interesting. Suddenly, Lenin appeared, who could barely move his legs due to fatigue. The reason was that Lars Duke married unexpectedly, so the imperial family's approval was needed. They also had to organize a reception in honor of Ceres, which his assistant was doing. The protagonist realized that she was the cause of his condition. But according to Lenin, that was trivial compared to her glacier inspection. Moreover, he understood that the girl was still weak, and her marriage to the master was not yet approved. So he wanted to take care of everything himself. Judging by Lenin's words and expression, he simply didn't want Ceres to feel guilty. The servants of House Burkov turned out to be much kinder than the protagonist imagined. And she sincerely thanked him. Blushing, Lenin recalled that the day after tomorrow was New Year's Day, and the protagonist had to take care of the organization. Some time later, Begonia helped the mistress with the organization, transforming her into a truly imposing figure. According to Searia, it turned out to be too ostentatious, but the tailor considered it just appropriate for the future Archduchess. Although Rush married her only to save her, Begonia believed that sometimes gestures of goodwill proved decisive. Suddenly, a maid ran towards them, who couldn't stop the visitor, who urgently wanted to see Sirius. Behind her appeared Lena, who begged the protagonist to talk to her. Begonia wanted to protest, but Sirius stopped her to remain alone with the visitor. The protagonist was interested in hearing what the Holy Lady wanted to tell her. When they were alone, Lena expressed the desire that Sirius stop blaming Callista for everything. She admitted that she constantly bothered him with stories about how she wanted to go to the glacier. But there she was surprised by a sudden snowstorm. The protagonist wondered if the saint knew that the Marquis was her fiancé. Of course Lena knew, but Caldes was her good friend, and she wanted to create one last shared memory with him. Searia decided to clarify that now that the last memory was made, wouldn't they see each other again? Lena got annoyed and shouted, and the protagonist realized she was provoking her exactly like in the novel. Crying inconsolably, the saint decided she just wanted to be friends with the girl. Slapping herself in the face, Searia didn't understand how an ex and a current wife could be friends. But Lena didn't understand why it was impossible, as they weren't even officially married. The protagonist considered it a personal matter, and at that moment, the maid entered to call her for an audience. As she got up to leave, she heard the saint's words about her mother. She had been a simple commoner who became an aristocrat. A few minutes earlier, Lenin arrived at the archbishop, complaining that he wasn't stopping his wife from overworking. But Rush didn't understand how he could forbid someone who truly loved him from working. Moreover, it's better for her to be busy than to be carried away by empty thoughts. Also, the archbishop was intrigued why his assistant suddenly cared about Siria's well-being. It turned out that Lenin simply wasn't indifferent to those who quickly carried out and efficiently their obligations. They quickly prepared for the celebration, and thanks to the mistress, Rush could now sit and calmly review the documents. Recalling them, the assistant was intrigued what exactly had caught the master's attention in those papers. It turned out the archbishop planned to make his last visit to the estate to expel the demons. He also intended to take Ceres, even if their marriage was temporary. The assistant was eager to know how the demons would react to seeing the mistress. And it turned out the archbishop was also interested. Meanwhile, the celebration was about to begin, so Rush headed to his wife's chambers to accompany her. To his surprise, next to Sirius's chambers, he saw Marquis Hennet. Upon learning that Calles had come for the saint, the archbishop was intrigued what Lena had forgotten there. However, the hero didn't know either, after which there was a long pause. Suddenly, Kali's became interested in when His Highness planned to annul the marriage with Sirius. He was deeply grateful to Rush for saving her and wished to fully compensate him on behalf of House Hennet. The Archbishop was deeply surprised, not understanding why the Marquis wanted to pay off his wife's debt. Did it perhaps, after everything that happened, still exist something that united them? Clenching his fists in anger, Collies confessed that he seriously intended to divorce Lena. Furthermore, he had obtained the official consent of Marquis Seliden to marry his daughter. It was intriguing whether His Highness had written to Searia's family, but Rauch considered it completely absurd. The Archduke entered into that marriage to save the heroine, and obviously didn't have time to consider all aspects. The blame for what happened rested with Collies. That's why Rush didn't understand how the Marquis could boast about such a thing. In the Archduke's judgment, someone who put his fiancée's life at risk was too talkative. The Marquis tried to retort, but suddenly they heard Lena scream from Searia's room. A few seconds earlier, Lena remembered that the heroine's mother had been a commoner turned aristocrat. In the novel, it was only mentioned once, but Searia reacted violently, resembling a furious bull. Meanwhile, the saint considered that she adored the girl's parents. Just for living in Searia's body, the heroine couldn't control her anger when her mother was mentioned. And now, as if she were the real heroine, she raised her arm fiercely towards the saint, terrifying her and the maids. But regaining her composure a second later, Searia corrected the trajectory of the blow and slapped herself so hard that her face turned completely red. She looked furiously at the guest. The heroine was intrigued how Lena had discovered that. It turned out she overheard it from her professor, Viscount Izon. However, hadn't he warned her that this topic infuriated Searia? Furthermore, talking about personal family histories is considered a grave offense. The heroine didn't understand how much more she could sacrifice for those who had deceived her, and continue to tolerate such things. Although Collies insisted again and again that their marriage was provisional, Lena remained the Marchioness of Hennet, saint and of the Stern family. People of her social status cannot openly express everything that crosses their minds, shamelessly towards those around them. Upon leaving, Searia considered that, being of legal age and holding a high social position, Lena should have matured more. Walking down the hallway, the protagonist didn't know whether to go and tell the priests about the saint's words. Although she clearly offended Searia, how would her words change the fact that she was a villain? So she decided to quickly return to her room, convinced that Begonia would be shocked. Suddenly, the Archbishop grabbed her arm, bewildered by what was happening to his wife. She looked at Rush in surprise and wondered if she had followed him. In the end, it turned out that Rush had been following her since the moment she left the room. He even seemed to have walked high enough to attract attention. With a chuckle, Sarah thought her thoughts had distracted her from the real world. Observing her attentively, Rush abruptly turned her head and looked at the mark of the blow. He seemed to recognize a mark very similar to those others bore after interacting with her some time ago. Then, the protagonist confessed that she had hit herself after an argument with Lena. Realizing that wasn't why he had come, Sarah didn't want to talk about her mother now. The Archbishop decided to go get some fresh air with her before going to the hall. Without asking her many questions. At first, the protagonist thought he wasn't interested at all, but then she understood that perhaps he was expressing his concern this way. At that moment, on one of the balconies, Collies appeared, looking for Searia. But upon seeing her with Rush, he froze. Observing how they chatted so kindly, the Marquis furiously squeezed the railings, feeling a growing discomfort. Upon going out, the protagonist sat on a bench, and while Rush remained seated with his eyes closed, Searia looked at him from time to time. Unable to take it anymore, the Archbishop decided to ask her why she wouldn't stop looking at him. The protagonist pretended that she was just afraid Rush would stain her immaculate white clothes. Smiling thoughtfully, the man decided that sometimes he would like to be able to see what was going on in Searia's mind. Searia was surprised by those words, and the Archbishop considered her thoughts too chaotic. In fact, he also didn't want the girl's dress to get ruined, and decided it was time to leave. The young woman was very happy that he liked the dress, chosen by Begonia, who thought the one Searia chose didn't suit her. She was also intrigued whether Marquis Hennet had entered the annex where she lived. Not expecting that question, Rush decided to find out why she insisted on asking that. The protagonist thought she smelled his perfume when leaving the room. The Marquis always liked to wear a specific scent to events. Surprised that she remembered his scent, Rush thought, perhaps she liked that damn guy so much. Meanwhile, the appearance of Collies and Lena at the reception caused a wave of indignation and anger among the other guests. Upon hearing that they were considered shameless, the saint decided that perhaps they should leave here. The Marquis insisted that the young woman had finally told what happened to her with Searia. Lena was irritated, as she had already explained before that she only came to apologize. And the heroine had made a scene. She started shouting angrily at Collies, not wanting to think about it anymore and demanding they stop reminding her. At that moment, Rouge and Searia solemnly entered the hall, under cheers and ovations, as well as admiring exclamations from the people. All the guests, without exception, admired the beauty and grace of the Archduke's unparalleled wife. The guests began to speculate that now, probably, they should call her Your Highness. Upon hearing that they decided to choose Searia as the star of the night, Lena stared fixedly at her, embraced by envy. Seeing the saint and the Marquis at the reception, Rush was very surprised, as he was sure that the heroine had cancelled her invitations. The young woman saw no optimal reason for it, but according to the Archduke, there were more than enough. But Searia felt that they deserved to be here as much as she did, as she by no means considered herself the star of the night. As some said, Rush was confused by those words, because if it wasn't her, then who? The heroine thought that in the presence of Collies and Lena, she felt like an extra, and at that moment the saint overheard them. But a servant stopped her, who had already warned Lena not to approach Mrs. Searia. Surprised that the protagonist seemed to enjoy humbling herself, the Archduke was sure that this reception was especially for her. He also wanted Searia to honor him, and by tradition, to inaugurate the evening with him. Obtaining permission, they stepped onto the center of the dance floor and began to spin in a waltz, under the gaze of the guests. While watching them, Lena decided to ask the servant why only those two were dancing. The reason was that Her Highness was a high-ranking person, equivalent to the imperial family. So she was intrigued by her and Collies' case, and it turned out that the saint also had a high status. But in the empire, there was a clear boundary between aristocrats and the imperial family. Suddenly, the servant had to retreat, leaving Lena alone. While enviously watching the protagonists dance, she thought that perhaps it would be better there. Later, at Lenin's request, Searia went out onto the Archduchess's terrace to enjoy a moment alone. She was intrigued that by celebrating her wedding with Collies without incident, she might avoid a tragic end and live in peace. The protagonist felt that the Marquis's feelings were genuine. But she still couldn't forget Lena, as in the novel. Suddenly, she heard his voice from behind, and turning around, Searia saw the saint. Looking directly into her eyes, Lena wanted to end the dialogue right now. At that moment, Lenin was surprised that Rush started calling her by her name, while the Archduke discovered that she had gone to the Archduchess's terrace. The aide thought perhaps he had acted too quickly by letting her go, but Rausch loved the idea, since she could rarely be alone. Meanwhile, Sari was surprised to see Lena on the terrace, where even the Archduke could not enter. Suddenly, the saint decided to confess that she had already asked Collies for a divorce. Lena already knew that divorce in Stern was as complicated as marriage, but she was willing to face it for the heroine. Taking Sari's hand, the girl sincerely wanted to return what she had taken. However, the heroine didn't care whether death or divorce separated her from the Marquis, since she felt nothing for him. Turning towards the door, Sari was surprised to find Collies there, eavesdropping on their conversation. At that moment, the saint shouted, convinced that she was of no importance there. Upon hearing that in her presence, Lena felt like an extra, the heroine recognized her own words to the Archduke. Not understanding why she was shouting, Searia never wanted to confront Lena, as she recognized her as the protagonist. But now, realizing that Kali's could be seen perfectly from where the saint was standing, Sarai understood that Lena had shouted it on purpose. Evidently, the saint wanted the Marquis to hear her and not stop believing in her sincerity. Or perhaps the reason was that Lena intended to present Sarai in a bad light. The heroine just didn't understand why Lena hated her so much when she had never done anything bad to her. Since the saint refused to leave, the protagonist decided to leave herself. But Lena suddenly ran after her. As soon as the saint grabbed her hand, Searia suddenly felt a strange energy behind her. Turning around, the protagonist saw only a shoe that Lena had dropped. Kali's was perplexed and horrified, thinking he had just pushed Searia off the balcony. Hearing those words, the protagonist's head spun, and she looked furiously at the Marquis. The servant, who had seen everything, didn't understand how his master could even think such a thing. At that moment, the protagonist understood that Kali's intended to torture her until the end. Surprised by himself, the Marquis tried to apologize, convinced that this was not what he meant to say. Suddenly, Lena appeared right above them, floating in the air surrounded by light. And the moonlight. Searia knew that in the book, the saint had disappeared and returned several times between her world. And this one. Catching her in his arms, the Marquis didn't understand at all what had just happened. Muttering that it was still too early, Lena began to scream, desperately asking for help. Surprised by her words, the protagonist remembered that the second time, the saint would disappear for a year. But now, Searia considered that irrelevant, as she never imagined Kali's would accuse her of murder. The Marquis desperately tried to pretend it was a mistake, hoping the protagonist wouldn't act like that towards him. However, Searia pretended not to hear him and continued walking away as Kalos screamed. Since getting the body of an incorrigible villain, the heroine did everything possible to survive. And even if she didn't manage to mend all of Searia's wickedness, the Marquis couldn't ignore the good she had done. Recalling that feeling of joy upon receiving his proposal, Searia felt a deep sadness within herself. Even if in the end she chose Lena, leaving her on the verge of death, Searia didn't expect all her effort to be in vain. Upon hearing from the man, who considered her his beloved, accusing her of murder, she understood that everything had been in vain. Sitting on the steps and covering her face with her hands, she didn't even notice Rush approaching her. Smiling, Searia thought she always let the prince see her in that state. Raising an eyebrow, Rush agreed that he always found her in that state. The Marquis and the saint spoke quite loudly, so, as it turned out, he had already heard everything. Caressing the heroine's cheek, the prince considered that she was about to cry. Completely agreeing with him, the young woman covered her face again, and tears sprang from her eyes. The next day, she found out from Lenin that the archbishop was furious about taking Lena to the church. Searia was surprised, having known Amos, the archbishop, who, although strict, never lost his composure. She was also surprised that the hero arrived so early just to talk about that. But it turned out there was another important and pending matter. Before informing her, Lenin decided to clarify if the protagonist had heard anything about Laurel Manor. Suddenly, Kali's burst into her room, begging Sarai to spare him some time. Apologizing for the audacity, Lenin decided to clarify if the milord really hadn't noticed. However, the Marquis decided that the servant himself would decide if he stayed or left. Kneeling next to the protagonist, he understood that his apologies wouldn't heal the wounds caused. Still, he decided to apologize and hoped Searia would give him another chance. The protagonist responded by clarifying if the Marquis was sure he wasn't going to see Lane if she called him again. Without waiting for an answer, she knew he wouldn't go, but would run as soon as the saint spoke his name. She remembered Kali's assumption from yesterday that he hit Lynn, which immediately made the Marquis doubt. Searia knew that not even the servant went that far. Only Kali's doubted her innocence. Knowing his reputation, the young woman understood it. Moreover, she almost lost her hand because of him. The protagonist didn't want to suffer more to avoid her death, and decided she had had enough of his attitude. She no longer wanted to worry eternally about whether he would run towards the saint again. From then on, feeling scared, she took out the wedding ring the Marquis had previously given her. Deciding their relationship was over forever, Searia threw the ring on the floor in front of the surprised Marquis. Then she walked out of the room, determined to continue the conversation with Lennon outside. Caldes remained sitting on the floor, looking confusedly at the ring in front of him. Crying in pain, he began to pity himself and regret what happened. As they left the palace and until they were on the street, Lennon said nothing. It turned out he wasn't sure if he should talk about matters now, which deeply surprised the heroine. But the hero didn't want to interfere with someone who had just suffered a breakup. However, Searia calmed Lennon, determined that everything was fine and ready to listen to him. The hero started talking about Burkov's assets, but suddenly the heroine was distracted. Looking happily to the side, Elliot and Abigail approached, greeting the mistress cheerfully. Interrupted halfway through, Lennon only had time to watch as Searia fell into her protector's arms. The heroine offered him her warmest jacket, but Abby considered it unnecessary. Searia also wanted her to go to the kitchen to eat hot soup to warm up. But the warrior didn't feel cold. Instead, Abby hoped the mistress had already decided which of the two to kill. Or both. Coughing discreetly, Elliot hoped Abigail would be more careful with her words, especially when someone else was around. At that moment, Lennon couldn't hold back any more and shouted, finally wishing to convey the important information to the heroine. In Burkov's possessions, there was a place very well known in certain circles. It was the Laurel settlement, about which the hero doubted the young woman had heard. And tomorrow, he would travel there with the archbishop. However, the heroine knew about it thanks to a book, which was a place where only Burkov's closest relatives could stay. Seeing the heroine's confused face, Lennon hoped she had no plans for tomorrow. But upon discovering she was free, the hero was very happy, as the archbishop had never been able to meet with her personally. Lennon understood that everything had arisen unexpectedly, but hoped that Searia would manage to prepare for the journey. That night, the heroine fell asleep peacefully in her room, but at dawn, she woke up suddenly inside a carriage, lying in Rush's arms. An hour earlier, the archbishop had entered her room, hoping she was already ready to leave. But to his surprise, Searia was sleeping peacefully in her bed, not waking up to his steps. The maid expressed the desire to wake her up immediately, but Rush considered it unnecessary. Seeing that it was the first time in a long time she had slept so deeply, the hero covered her with a blanket and took her in his arms, determined to travel like that. Upon waking, the heroine's first desire was for the Archduke to let her go so she could sit on the other side. However, he did not, as Searia was not wearing shoes, since she hadn't had time to grab her slippers. Understanding that it was cold inside the carriage, Rush began to cover her feet with his hand to warm them. Blushing with shame, Searia wanted him to let go, as the Archduke surely didn't touch others' feet. Smiling, Rush thought she was not a stranger to him. Suddenly, considering everything that happened, the heroine blushed even more upon reaching that conclusion. Concentrating, she decided to clarify if the Archduke had taken her to the Laurel estate to spend their first wedding night. With a mocking smile, Rush pretended that this was precisely why he had taken her. However, seeing her expression, Searia immediately understood he was lying. It turned out he was only holding her feet because it was cold, as there was no other way to warm them in the carriage. Still, she wanted to refuse his kindness, accidentally calling herself Archduchess. The heroine tried to correct herself instantly, but Rush saw no need, as she was indeed his Archduchess. And if the young woman objected to him holding her feet, the hero couldn't refuse, wrapping them in a blanket. Suddenly, the carriage began to shake as if during an earthquake, leading the heroes to confusion. From outside, the soldiers' shouts were heard, saying that monsters had attacked them. Clarifying that the estate gates were right on the way, Rush immediately ordered everyone to put on their astral armor. Understanding that the presence of Stern was a great stroke of luck, the Archduke left Searia in the carriage, promising to send Lennon. As she tried to exit the carriage, she suddenly felt the heroine grabbing the cape of his armor. Searia only wanted the Archduke to take care of himself and not get into trouble. Receiving this promise, the protagonist watched Rush run towards the battle. Looking out the carriage window, the young woman decided that the weather that day was simply awful. A rampant battle began outside. The knights fought desperately in a fierce struggle, repelling the creatures' ferocious onslaughts. Observing what was happening from the carriage window, Searia didn't understand. Had the monsters appeared because she hadn't been at the glacier for 2 days? Suddenly, Lennon ran towards her, amazed by how warm his carriage was. The young woman thought he had been riding, but it turned out he was sitting behind the carriage, next to the luggage. Searia was intrigued why he hadn't gotten into the carriage with them, but the protagonist pretended he had to check something. Suddenly, she decided to ask him if he knew they should arrive soon. Lennon wanted that as soon as they entered the gates, she shouldn't use a respectful tone with anyone, except for the Archduke. While speaking, Searia noticed a dark figure rising behind the window. At that very moment, the protagonist was horrified and confused upon seeing 2 large red eyes staring at him from outside. Discovering them inside, the enormous monster began to shake the carriage, trying to reach its victims. Realizing the carriage had been attacked, Rush froze and a second later. Then he ran to help them. Meanwhile, the carriage lay overturned, and upon regaining some sense, Searia turned to Lennon, hoping he was all right. The protagonist felt fine, but upon seeing the mark of demonic energy on his cheek, the young woman went into shock. The only discomfort she felt was a slight dizziness, but Searia understood that this was just the beginning. She decided not to waste time and hugged him tightly, leaving him stunned. Now she needed to sit as still as possible, because if she released demonic energy, the consequences would be terrible. It was difficult for Searia to clean, but she was confident she could handle the situation. Suddenly, the monster made a hole in the carriage and furiously reached out its hand towards the heroes. At that moment, Rush suddenly appeared and with a single sword strike knocked the monster to the ground. Turning to Searia, the Archduke hoped she wasn't injured. Upon learning he was fine, he wondered if Lennon was dead. Hearing he was alive, Rush frowned, not understanding how to explain his hug. The girl hastily explained that she was just trying to clean the hero of demonic energy. Showing her cheek, Rush continued to watch them suspiciously, while the heroine was very happy to see Lennon healed. Meanwhile, the knights successfully repelled the monster's attack, although the carriage was destroyed. Then, the Archduke decided that they would cover the rest of the way on horseback. The heroine didn't object to this turn, as she felt quite comfortable in the saddle. Looking at her perplexed, Rush didn't understand the importance of that, which left Searia bewildered. However, she soon understood his intention upon finding herself in the Archduke's hands, feeling like a silkworm cocoon. Sensing the cold radiating from the young woman, Rush wished she would remain still so as not to freeze. Leaning against the Archduke's bare chest, the protagonist felt an extraordinary warmth emanating from him. After a short time, they finally arrived, meeting directly in front of the gates of the Laurel Manor. Rush carried Searia in his arms directly to the lobby of the inhospitable building, whose interior turned out to be as dirty as expected. Even from outside, the protagonist sensed that something unpleasant lurked there. Noticing the young woman's alert gaze, the Archduke was struck. What was happening? Pretending only to be surprised by how different the place was from his palace, Searia spotted a woman on the stairs. Coming down and seeing Rush at the entrance holding the mistress in his arms, the lady was surprised. Searia decided to clarify that she was a temporary mistress, after which the woman was shocked. The lady, furious, started shouting at the Archduke, for whom the marriage was apparently like a trial meal. Approaching, she abruptly took Searia's hands, horrified to find they were ice cold. In turn, the protagonist was greatly surprised to feel the woman's hands so warm. At that moment, Lennon arrived, informing the master that the knights were waiting for him at the gates. Then, Rush decided to hand the young woman over to the lady, named Marta, but Searia resisted, thinking she could still walk on her own. Moreover, she was embarrassed that an adult woman had to carry her, but Marta took her up easily, considering the floor too dirty. The girl was surprised by how strong the lady turned out to be, and Marta wished that in the future she would call her by name. After that, Rush calmly turned around and headed for the exit, without even saying goodbye to the protagonist. Searia wanted to say goodbye by waving her hand, but the protagonist slammed the door shut after leaving, which Marta didn't find strange, as Rush was cold towards emotions. The lady decided to clarify again that the protagonist should address her by name, since she probably hadn't been formal with Lennon. However, upon discovering that the girl, without understanding anything, had spoken formally to the protagonist, Marta fixed a furious gaze on him. Now the lady wanted to get satisfactory explanations from Lennon, which surprised Searia and terrified the protagonist. First, Marta decided to take the girl to the bathroom. And on the way, while inspecting the property, Searia was surprised by the state of ruin around her. Surprisingly, however, the bathroom was in more than acceptable condition. While rubbing Searia's hair, Marta confessed that she thought Lars Duke had kidnapped her and was hiding her there. Although the protagonist believed he wasn't capable of that, the lady knew that Rush was more emotional than he appeared. At that moment, the protagonist suddenly noticed that, although the bathroom was clean, it looked very simple compared to others Searia knew. As if reading her thoughts, Marta clarified that normally this bathroom was used by the staff, and the others were in an unacceptable condition. The girl was amazed to learn that there were other people there, and it turned out there were two more: the gardener and the butler. Searia was perplexed, as she firmly believed that nobody was taking care of the property since it was abandoned. Looking at the moldy ceilings, she didn't understand why the Archduke had abandoned that place. Meanwhile, Lennon noticed that the palace was exactly the same as before, something the butler Bastian completely agreed with. The hero was intrigued whether it would be comfortable to live there, as it was well known that the butler of House Burkov never appeared in the main palace. However, after living there for over 10 years, Bastian didn't complain, as guests were rare in the main palace. He was also intrigued whether the new Archduchess would be precisely Searia Stern, whom Lennon had recently considered cruel and ignorant. Hearing this, the hero felt confused, hoping the butler wouldn't tell the heroine. Bastian agreed, but didn't understand what had happened to the girl for Lennon to have changed his opinion of her so suddenly. As Searia approached at that moment, she wondered who and what had changed. Surprised by the unexpected situation, the hero immediately seated her at the table, greeting her with a slight steam. At that instant, the butler approached her, for whom it was an honor to meet the mistress. Bastian introduced himself, wishing the heroine would call him by his name, realizing that it was the first time she had seen the butler of the main palace. The girl was also very happy to meet him. Bastian hoped that Searia would forgive the other servants, who were busy with their tasks and hadn't been able to receive her. As the conversation continued, the heroine looked behind the butler and discovered a large amount of mold everywhere. Seeing that it was moving, Searia supposed it was precisely hardened demonic energy. If this assumption is correct, it means that in front of her there are demonic shadows. This is how Lena baptized the clots of demonic energy that solidified, becoming a byproduct of the curse. In the second part of the story, even the saint managed to influence the imperial family by cleansing these shadows. Seeing Searia's thoughtful gaze, Lennon was surprised, thinking he had never heard of this from His Highness. It concerned this tribe, and after trying everything possible, the Archduke called magicians from the kingdom of Ness to the castle. Upon hearing this, the girl opened her mouth in astonishment and looked perplexedly at the hero. It turned out the castle had been infested with moe for over 15 years. She tried every method known on the continent, but without success. However, knowing that the High Church considers magicians heretics, Searia didn't understand whether she should tell him that, since she was the Stern. In response, Lennon smiled, thinking that His Highness would generously reward the heroine for her silence. So, the girl thought it would have been easier not to bring her here, but it turned out that Rush wanted to introduce her to Mrs. Marta. With her head bowed, self-conscious, Searia decided that they could come then after the magicians performed their ritual here. After that, the hero suddenly darkened, as the issue was that it was the last attempt. Confused by his words and appearance, the heroine didn't understand what exactly he meant. Meanwhile, the Archduke was near the castle, looking at it thoughtfully, when suddenly footsteps were heard behind him. Turning around and seeing the knight, he confirmed that the creatures in the area had been eliminated. The soldier, like all other members of the party, was worried that the magicians hadn't reached the castle yet. But Rush was calm, sure that a snowstorm had delayed them, and that they would arrive tomorrow. So there was no reason to worry. Dismissing the knight, the Archduke promised himself that this time they would protect her. Then Marta took Searia to her rooms to sleep, hoping she would like them. The heroine found them very cozy and thanked the lady for her care. After which the woman took her hands. Marta wanted that while she was there, she should address them without formalities. Moreover, she considered it an honor to attend to such a charming young woman, even if only for a few days. Since she didn't understand why it was only about 2 days, Sari remembered the end of her conversation with Lenin. She knew that the mold was destroying the castle and that it wouldn't last much longer. So Sari was intrigued why they weren't evacuating the servants immediately. The hero wanted to answer, but unable to say it, he decided that the heroine would soon find out for herself. None of this was mentioned in the novel, so now the young woman didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, since the master was late, Marta decided it was best for Searia to go to bed already. The heroine was intrigued where Roch would sleep, and then the lady looked at her in surprise. Upon learning that he would spend the night there, since it was the Archbishop's chambers. Searia was shocked. Seeing the surprise in her eyes, Marta laughed tenderly, pretending she had simply forgotten to mention it. Later, Roch returned to the place, walking down the hallway accompanied by Bastian. Suddenly, a dark energy enveloped the Archduke's legs, and a noise was heard from somewhere. Looking ahead, he saw Martha, who was happy about his return. Rush, for his part, was happy to know that the heroine was well and had slept without any inconvenience. Bastian decided to clarify whether it was indeed that same Searia Stern, since a few years ago. Lenin had described her completely differently. Confirming it was her, the butler wanted to know why she had changed so much. According to the Archbishop, nothing had happened, and she became like this after falling in love with a villain. After that, he went to the locker room, took off his armor, and returned to his chambers. Upon entering, he didn't immediately locate her, as the girl was sleeping peacefully, curled up in the fetal position. Rush stood still, as Marta hadn't informed him that Searia would sleep in his chambers. Moreover, he was disconcerted to see that the heroine was in a chair, shivering with cold. Considering her quite small, the Archduke carefully moved her to the bed. Thinking it would have been better if she had fallen asleep directly in bed, Rausch worried if she would freeze. The air in the room was cold, and the hero quickly lit the fireplace. However, the room was still chilly, and the heroine continued to shiver with cold. Not wanting the precious Stern to die in her sleep, the Archduke approached and covered her with a blanket. At that moment, Rauch's gaze unintentionally stopped on the young woman, and memories of her words in the carriage about their wedding night began to flash through his mind. But instantly, he composed himself and turned away, not understanding what thoughts were invading him. Suddenly, the heroine turned towards him, holding Rauch's hand and leaving him perplexed. The next day, Searia woke up feeling that the bed was incredibly warm and elastic. At that very instant, she immediately opened her eyes, and upon seeing that she was clinging to the Archduke's bare chest, she was horrified. Turning around, she tried to get out of bed, not understanding why Rush was keeping her close. Finally managing to sit up, she turned towards him to cover him with the blanket. But suddenly, her gaze fixed on the Archduke's face, which was incredibly attractive. Unable to look away, Searia didn't understand how someone could have such perfect facial features. Suddenly, she realized their faces were very close to each other. And at that moment, Rush opened his eyes. Blushing immediately, the heroine jumped backward off the bed. And the Archduke was intrigued whether she was tired of admiring him and was leaving. Even more embarrassed, the young woman pretended she was just covering him with the blanket. She was also interested in knowing if it was really Marta who moved her to the bed. She was surprised to discover it was Rush, but it turned out the hero couldn't allow his wife to sleep in the armchair while he occupied the bed. He was also intrigued why he ended up sleeping here, completely curled up. And it turned out it was more comfortable for her that way. Rush was convinced that she was just afraid he might do something inappropriate. But the heroine desperately denied it. After a while, they arrived at the dining room for breakfast and sat facing each other. After serving them, Marta and Bastian quickly left, leaving the couple alone. Searia admitted that she knew about the magicians and considered that perhaps she should stay in the chambers. But the Archduke saw no need for it. The heroine decided that since she owed him her life, she would never report the hero to the High Church. Smiling in return, Rush considered it very kind of her. After a brief silence, the heroine decided to inquire about the manor, whose conditions were abnormal. I didn't understand why Roch kept insisting that Marta and Bastian remain there. However, it turned out he wasn't doing any of that, and the girl was intrigued as to why they were there. The servants were tied to the manor and couldn't take a single step outside of it, even if they wanted to. To be precise, only Marta couldn't leave, while the others pretended they liked being there and didn't want to leave. Searia understood that Marta was tied to the manor, which could no longer contain the pressure of the shadows. And if it collapsed, the mistress would die. The hero decided to turn to the magicians to rescue her, and it wasn't the first time. He had tried to do so previously. Suddenly, with a dejected face, Rush decided it had all been his fault, which deeply surprised the heroine. Later, upon leaving the building with Lenin, Searia was surprised that his lordship had gone to inspect the borders, despite the high accumulations of snow. However, the hero considered it reasonable, since having found monsters. The master was extremely cautious. Regarding the heroine's concern, Lenin opined that she didn't know Rush well, who would even emerge alive from the heart of the desert. Unable to stand it anymore, Searia decided to ask the hero directly what had happened here. Not expecting that question, Lenin was a bit surprised, but in the end decided to tell the truth, since she was now also a member of the Burkov family. 15 years ago, the previous Archduke brought his illegitimate son to this property. Both wished to overthrow Rush from his position as heir, which is why the Archduke always found something to reproach him for. Furthermore, he threatened Sir Elliot, the young master's only knight at that time, with chests from the Emerald Sea. Whoever inserted a lock of hair into them could never leave the territory of the property. The Archduke continued pressuring Elliot, not understanding why he refused to do so if he truly wished to become a knight of House Burkov. In the end, Mrs. Martha inserted a lock of hair there so that Rush's only knight would not belong to that place forever. Since then, he couldn't leave the property, and those who loved him decided to stay with him. Searia knew that nothing like this appeared in the book and didn't understand why Rush's father had acted this way. Seeing the confusion in her eyes, Lenin hoped the girl wouldn't be offended by the master for having brought her to this horrible place. As far as the protagonist knew, Rush only wanted to introduce his wife to Mrs. Marta. Smiling, the heroine decided that she wasn't offended at all, but rather the opposite, grateful for sharing that information with her. Looking at the estate, Searia thought there must surely be a way to save the building and the people who considered it their home. After a while, she approached one of the moho branches and tried to clean it. The heroine was very happy to see how the dark stains gradually started to disappear. However, Searia's cleaning power was too weak, and at that rate it would take 1,000 years. In the novel, Lena discovered the source of the demonic energy and purified it using her holy power. So that was what needed to be done. Meanwhile, Butler Bastian arrived, bringing a girl named Suzette. It turned out she was the seamstress and gardener of the Laurel estate, who was happy to greet her belatedly. Searia introduced herself and cheerfully greeted the girl, while Suzette looked mysteriously at the butler. Bastian invited the lady to follow him to the living room, clarifying that they had prepared dishes that she would surely like. Upon hearing talk of food to her liking, Searia looked at the butler in surprise, not understanding what it was about. But later, upon sitting at the table, she was even more shocked to see dozens of different desserts in front of her. Marta was enthusiastic, remembering how perplexed they were when the master brought so much sweetness. They were all sure it was for Searia, and upon learning this, the girl was petrified. It wasn't that she disliked pastries, but she simply didn't have the strength to eat so many. Marta and Bastian were surprised, as according to Rush, his wife adored sweets. At first, the protagonist was disconcerted, not understanding why the Archduke would think that. But suddenly, it occurred to her. Turning to the servants, she was intrigued to know the reason why the butler decided to stay here. Surprised by such a question, Bastian recalled that in this property there was a strange crag composed of a special type of sugar. So the butler pretended that after tasting this sugar, he no longer liked any flavor. Although, of course, Rush didn't believe him. Looking at him thoughtfully, the young woman focused her gaze again on the desserts, as they were intended for Bastian to show him what sweets exist outside the property. Although it was clear to Lars Duke that the reason given by the butler was fictitious, he implied that Bastian should move on. The butler was stunned, suspecting nothing of the meaning Rush had put into those sweets. And Marta couldn't hold back tears. Looking at them, Searia thought that Lars Duke cared a lot about those people. The girl perfectly knew that this was none of her business, but she felt as if her heart clenched. It was time to admit that she, somehow, had grown attached to this place. By being in Searia's body, she suffered every day just to survive, and for a long time had not enjoyed such a complete rest as now. The heroine deeply loved this spacious and quiet manor with all her heart. Although Rush grew up here, this place was never mentioned in the novel. It was never said that anything happened here, and Lena never came to this place. The heroine sincerely believed that she had every reason to consider it hers. At least, she could be sure that the solarium would never abandon her for Lena, as Kelly's did. The first thing she had to do was search for the demonic origin. After several hours, she finally found the staircase leading to the dungeons. Searia thought it must be there, as it emanated a more intense demonic energy. However, she remembered Marta's words that the magicians from Nestle arrived. And they went to the dungeons so as not to meet the heroine. While hesitating whether to go down or not, Searia didn't notice a man approaching her from behind. He immediately placed his hand on her shoulder. Lennon got a chill and asked what she was doing there. Seeing that he was scared, the hero tried to apologize, but suddenly received a blow to the neck that knocked him unconscious. Seeing him fall backward in front of her, the heroine didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, she saw the gardener Suzette, who had hit Lennon, looking furiously at his body with a sword in her hand. Searia looked at her terrified, shocked by what had happened. But the maid did it because the hero dared to approach his mistress. Furthermore, Suzette hoped the mistress would stop speaking so formally to him as soon as possible. The girl had been trying for a long time to correct Lennon's bad habits and hoped the mistress would forgive this one mistake. At that moment, Searia understood that Suzette reminded her of Abby, although the gardener was much crueler. Suddenly, the maid became interested in whether the heroine wanted to inspect the basement. Searia was happy, but didn't know if it was allowed, although her thirst suggested that in the palace there were no places the mistress couldn't access. The Archduke gave his permission personally. Therefore, if the lady wishes, you can go there together. Upon descending, the girls saw a large door emitting a strange glow and sensed the smell of burnt grass. Peeking through the door, they saw a group of magicians reciting a spell. Under the feet of one of the magicians, Searia saw a small open sack from which a grass peeked out that turned out to be insania. Insania was a common wild grass, but in those who possessed divine power, it acted as a sleeping pill. That's why the heroine didn't understand how they dared to burn it where the head of the 17 great clans was located. Determined to ask directly, Searia bravely approached the magicians, leaving them stunned. It turned out they knew His Highness would be absent for a while, so there was no problem at all. Furthermore, that grass was a fundamental part of their attempts to clear this threatening darkness. After these words, the magician pointed his hand towards a table where the chest of the Emerald Sea was located. Suddenly, one of them approached the protagonist without understanding who she really was. At first, Searia got very scared, but regaining her composure, she demanded that they immediately stop doing such nonsense. Since the magicians perfectly knew who she was, the protagonist was intrigued where they got so much impertinence to demand an answer from her. She took a determined step towards the trunk, but one of the magicians abruptly raised his hand, blocking her way, but her thirst immediately placed the blade of her sword against his throat. Furious at the audacity of that guy for standing in the way of the mistress. Seeing Searia looking inside the trunk, the magician demanded that she immediately lower her sword. But the gardener wanted him to shut up. Upon trying to purify the darkness in the trunk, the protagonist confirmed that her assumption was correct. Her powers were not powerful enough. Realizing they had nothing more to do there, Searia decided to leave immediately. Now, the protagonist was sure that everything was due to the Emerald Sea Trunk. But she didn't know what to do. Later, she gifted Rush a branch of silver laurel, leaving him perplexed. The girl only wanted him to take her with him, as every day he goes to check if monsters have appeared around. The Archduke saw no need for such a gift, as Esterna was by his side. However, Searia felt that she couldn't hug and purify him like she did with Lennon, which according to Rush sounded strange. Shouldn't it feel more natural for her to hug him, being husband and wife as they were? Smiling, the protagonist accepted, but not in his chambers, but for example in the hall. He let out an ironic sigh and decided that sometimes his wife was surprisingly naive. He learned from the young woman that she had gone down to the basement with Suzette today, and the magicians had behaved quite shamelessly. Rush also paid attention to the bouquet tied in the vase and discovered it was a gift from Searia by the gardener. At that moment, the heroine suddenly realized that she didn't remember if any of the servants there appeared in the original story, and if that meant they would die. She decided that, knowing the solution, she couldn't waste time, so she remembered that she had been exploring around there for some time. Upon learning that she had found a way to purify the palace, the Archduke stood still in surprise. Focusing her determination, Searia was convinced that Saint Lena had the ability to help with that. Now the idea arose in her whether she would become the person who would unite Rush and Lena. Of course, their marriage was temporary. First Kali's, now Rush, and because of all that, it felt uncomfortable for the young woman. However, the Archduke and the Saint were the main characters, and no matter how this ended for Searia, they were destined to be together. But suddenly, Rush decided he didn't want to hear any more mention of the Saint. Instead, he wanted to know if there were other options, and if the heroine could solve it herself. Furthermore, he had no intention of allowing a woman unrelated to his family to enter this house. So, Searia considered that the Archduke could hire Lena as his companion. Becoming serious, Rush decided to express himself more clearly. He didn't want anyone to enter this house except his Archduchess. Searia still didn't understand why he refused. When Lena was the only one capable of saving this place, the heroine knew it sounded presumptuous. But she didn't want anyone to die here at all. Understanding that the reason for wanting to bring Lena was this, the hero slapped himself in the face with the palm of his hand. He decided that Sarai completely lacked pride, which surprised the girl. Rouge believed that if she could take care of others, she should first think of herself. Did she not fear following in the footsteps of Marquis Genet, something that finally shocked Sarai? Could she not fear if this place was perfect and quiet, and the people friendly and willing to share kindness? Just thinking that Lena would become the center of this world, envy hurt the heroine. And that Rush would also choose her, not even daring to imagine it. But what she knew for certain was that everyone living here would die. In such a situation, can one feign ignorance when you know how to save everyone? Upon standing up, Searia considered that she only wanted to help and did not deserve such harsh words. As for Kali's, she chose him, but the Archduke and Laurel Palace were not her choice. With a smile, Rush accepted that he was not the man Searia had chosen. Therefore, the heroine no longer desired special attention. But the Archduke, in turn, believed that she had misinterpreted him. The girl completely agreed that she was mistaken, which was very cheeky of her. She didn't care if he called Lena, so she wanted the Archduke to think things through. After that, she left with a loud slam, leaving Ruch in silent bewilderment. Head bowed and face covered by her hands, she let out a deep sigh, regretting her words. While walking down the dark corridor of the small palace, Searia thought things had gone very wrong. Since lately, they had connected well. According to Lenin, Marta was tied to this place, because of an illegitimate brother of the archbishop, born from another woman. Absorbed in her thoughts, the protagonist suddenly saw a body lying in front of her. Recognizing it as Marta, her mind clouded with terror, and she ran at full speed towards her. The protagonist shook her and called her desperately, but Marta didn't react. Suddenly, Searia noticed something warm on the woman's body, and upon touching it, realized it was blood. When resolving to call Rush, she immediately saw a knife pressed against her throat. One of the magicians invited to the small palace was delighted to find the best offering for his god. At that very moment, Suzette appeared and kicked the magician hard, driving him into the ground. Turning towards Searia, he hoped His Highness was all right. Suddenly, Bastian appeared, who immediately ran towards Marta, wishing she was unharmed. When he first met the magicians, the protagonist found it strange that they didn't recognize her. Now, looking furiously at the enemy, she demanded an explanation. "Why did you come here?" After visiting the underground, Searia discovered that her thirst was a night. The heroine found something strange about the magicians, so she wanted the gardener to follow him. Now Searia was relieved to have called for help, but she couldn't even imagine such behavior. It turned out her thirst had left one tied up on the first floor, and he came here for the other two. Suddenly, the third magician appeared. He quickly approached the girls and directed the knife towards Searia. At the same moment, the dagger passed between the girls and stuck into the magician's body. Rush, who threw it, looked disdainfully at the enemies, considering them true savages. Afterward, he immediately ran towards them, hoping Searia and Marta were fine. Later, he sent the heroine back to her chambers, and lying in bed, she was shocked by the day she lived. Moreover, due to her argument with the Archduke, it was uncomfortable for her to be in his room. It was comforting that at least they managed to save Marta, since the attacker did not damage her vital organs. Suddenly, she felt someone sit on the bed and realized it was Rush. Pretending to sleep, Searia didn't feel like talking to him and decided he could manage in the armchair. Or on the floor if he wanted to. Suddenly, she felt the Archduke's warm hand brush her head. Then it began to move down slowly and remove the blanket. She jumped up indignant and blushing, staring at him stunned without understanding what he intended. It turned out the hero just wanted to make sure she wasn't injured. Upon hearing she was fine, Ruch recalled that Searia had suspected the shamans for some time. Something his thirst also knew. He thought she could have been seriously injured if the sword had reached its target. And he wondered how Searia kept putting her life in danger. The hero didn't understand how anyone could be so reckless, which angered the girl even more. Looking him in the eyes, she was sure that the magicians wouldn't have harmed her, since they perfectly knew she was stern. So, nothing that could have bothered the Archduke should have happened. Ruch was shocked by what he heard, as the heroine perfectly understood that it wasn't about that. He wondered why she hadn't told him anything about her doubts regarding the magicians. Just the fact that he had decided to ask already irritated Searia. What could someone who broke off their marriage just to mock her choices say? The Archduke took every opportunity to hurt Searia, and since she had disappointed him, he tried to scare and silence her. That's how she saw it. So, how could she have discussed her safety with him afterward? Furthermore, she was intrigued how Ruch would act if he were in her place. The protagonist, convinced he never wished for something like that, reached out his hand to calm her. But the girl immediately refused. Suddenly, Searia heard his apologies, which left her in a trance. Now Rush realized he shouldn't have made such light comments and apologized for it. Surprised, the protagonist was stunned to see that the Archduke not only apologized to her once, but apologized twice. Trying to respond, she moved and accidentally hit him in the stomach. Terrified, Rush was confused, thinking that Searia didn't know how to attack a knight since it didn't even prick him, let alone hurt him. Smiling, the protagonist decided that if he even apologized, she shouldn't hold on to her pride even less. Besides, she understood him. Addressing His Highness, the girl looked down shyly, moved to the other end of the bed, and gave him space. The protagonist was intrigued whether she wanted him to lie down next to her. But the girl considered that question unnecessarily uncomfortable. Blushing, Searia decided that surely Rush must be tired from everything that happened that day. And he wouldn't want to spend the night sitting. However, the Archduke would not be surprised if she proposed something like that to him, which surprised the girl. Did he perhaps wish that for her? Convinced that he didn't wish that for her, Rush abruptly approached Searia and touched her face with his hand. Looking her in the eyes, he wanted the protagonist to name him out loud right now. The girl was stunned. She didn't know how to behave in such a situation, giving up. Searia pronounced his name tenderly, and their lips drew close to each other. A second away from melting into a passionate kiss, Searia suddenly heard a strange sound somewhere. Diverting her gaze from Rush, she looked around astonished without understanding what its origin could be. Looking at her perplexed, the Archduke decided to clarify what sound it was, which surprised her even more. However, seeing her trembling hands, Rush understood that it was no joke. And he decided to stop pretending. In reality, he had also clearly heard it, and not for the first time. The young woman looked at him stunned, not understanding why he didn't confess immediately, when she almost went crazy. As it turned out, the Archduke was also disturbed by that sound, and upon starting to get out of bed, he finally decided to discover its origin. Despite the sound being quite loud, no one in the manor, except the two of them, heard it, which was very strange. Searia remembered that the Gyru Empire was founded by the great Saint Gremmel, blessed by the heavens. He granted him 2 divine gifts, the first being a great fortune that extended to his imperial family. The second blessing was the 17 lineages possessing their own divine strength. Thanks to Gremmel, these houses continued to transmit sacred magic to new generations, known under the title of Grand Vanchet. Among them, the representative houses were that of the Hennets, that of the Keldons, and that of the Burg. Searia thought that if they, possessing divine strength, heard it, perhaps there was an altar in the basement of the manor. Surprised by such a supposition, Rush considered that nothing similar could exist in these lands. The protagonist clearly felt a weak force while in the catacombs, probably coming from some ancient relic. Understanding where she wanted to go, the protagonist insisted that Searia wait in the room while he inspected it himself. But the girl decided she had forgotten she was a stern and decided to accompany him without problems. Walking down the corridor where, suddenly and without reason, all the candles went out, Searia didn't understand how the story had turned into horror. Rush thought she was trembling from the cold, but the protagonist was just very scared. Surprised, the Archduke considered it paradoxical, since before she acted impulsively. But now she was trembling in the darkness. Taking the protagonist's hand in his large and warm palm, Rush firmly led her forward. Suddenly, they stopped in front of the portrait of a woman who turned out to be the former Archduchess and mother of the protagonist. Searia was amazed by the lady's beauty and wondered if her personality was similar to her son's. Meanwhile, the Archduke moved away from his mother's portrait and started skimming a book. They turned out to be historical records of House Burkov, and after tearing out some pages, Rush brought her here for safety. Searia remembered that this book had been mentioned a few times in the romance, but neither she nor the Archduke had given it much importance. Knowing that Rauch's father was trying to dethrone his son, the protagonist believed that he himself had torn out those 2 pages. In this way, being the head of a great house, the protagonist inherited only a part of the family history transmitted from generation to generation. Suddenly, Searia felt a strange energy again, and turning around, saw a bright glow in the distance. Entering a small arcade, she saw a stand and behind it, a Constellation steel monolith. The young woman was surprised that such a valuable object as star steel was kept in the catacombs, moreover in such quantity. Looking at the stand, she saw a golden diadem with red stones emitting that same energy. At that very moment, she clearly heard a voice wishing that she would take it, after which her hands moved on their own towards the ornament. At that moment, detaching himself from the book, Rush also noticed the glow and looked perplexedly at Searia. Seeing the young woman reaching out her hands towards the diadem shining with magic, the hero was horrified and lunged towards her. Upon touching the object, the heroine was blinded by a bright explosion. after which she heard the voice wishing to live at least one normal day again. In the complete darkness, she saw a tearful young woman who didn't want the moon to reject her. A moment later, she opened her eyes abruptly without understanding what was happening. Immediately, she heard a female scream and found herself instantly in Abby's arms. It turned out that, on the third day of the heroine being unconscious, the knight was ready to destroy the entire palace with her own hands. Searia, stupefied to have slept 3 consecutive days, didn't understand where she was now. Suddenly, it occurred to her that seeing Abby meant they had returned her to the main palace. She was now in the Archduchess's chambers, where Rutch had ordered the servants to bring her. At that moment, Bastian and Suzette entered, who looked happily at the recovered young woman. At first, Searia was happy about their appearance, but suddenly remembered that she was not in Laurel. Which meant, how could they be there? But suddenly, the servants knelt down, bowing their heads to the heroine, which bewildered her even more. They wanted to express their deepest gratitude to Searia and also convey a personal thanks from Marta. Bastian decided that they would never forget the price the heroine paid to save the Laurel Mansion. Finally stunned by those words, Searia didn't understand. Had the shadows disappeared? According to the servants, the manor had been completely purified, and now they wanted to devote themselves entirely to the service of the Archduchess. Searia was in shock at what was happening. How could the demonic shadows have disappeared if Lena hadn't even approached that place? Meanwhile, Marta stood in front of Laurel Palace, which seemed to have regained a second life. The woman couldn't stop being happy that the building had finally regained its former splendor. A few days ago, in one of the mansion's corridors, she suddenly saw Searia. On that occasion, the heroine tried to purify the shadows before her eyes, but without success, which saddened her deeply. And now, Marta was very happy that House Burkov had finally found an excellent archduchess. Upon getting out of bed, Searia saw the same diadem on the bedside table, which upon touching caused her to lose consciousness. Looking at it attentively, the young woman suddenly remembered that this ornament also appeared in the original novel. In the novel, the diadem ended up in the hands of Searia's older brother, Nissus Kelidon. After a fierce fight between several heroes, Nissus gave this ornament to Lena, and since then, the protagonist wore it every time she went out. But how did the diadem end up on the Laurel estate? Searia believed that her older brother had bought it at some auction house. Smiling, she thought that if the object had been found on the estate, perhaps she should give it to Rush. Upon hearing from Suzette that the master had gifted it to his archduchess, the young woman was confused. Knowing it was an important family relic, she didn't understand why he had gifted her something so valuable. Looking once more at the diadem, and remembering those terrible visions about the young woman, Searia didn't remember anything similar being mentioned in the book. At night, she walked along the path next to the estate, where they had agreed to meet the Archduke. Seeing her bracing herself, Rush thought she must be freezing, so he threw his cloak over her. Sitting down with her on the bench, the hero hoped Searia was feeling better by now. Smiling in turn, the heroine considered that on this occasion, he had become interested faster than usual. However, that was precisely what she wanted to talk about, taking out the ornament he had gifted her. Thanking Rouge for the beautiful gift, Searia decided to wear it as a necklace, since, in her opinion, wearing it on her head would be excessive. Frowning slightly, the Archduke decided it didn't sound so terrible. Then the young woman thought perhaps he wanted to dress her personally, to which the hero nodded firmly. If Searia put it on him. The heroine, feigning a serious expression, thought she was able to decide, which Rush found amusing. He asked her to tilt her head slightly, and without warning, began to take the necklace off her. He gave it to the girl, and he himself tilted his head, so Searia began to put it around his neck. At that moment, their faces were almost touching, which made the protagonist very nervous. Looking her in the eyes, Rush thanked Searia for saving the Laurel Palace, considering himself her eternal debtor now. After this, a long pause occurred, and their gazes remained fixed on each other. Suddenly, Searia decided that the necklace didn't suit him at all, and abruptly tore it from Rush's neck. She thought it would be better to take it herself, to which Rush instantly nodded. Taking the pendant, The heroine became curious whether the Archduke knew that this object contained divine power. Ruch saw the relic as something quite common, but Searia understood that it held a great amount of power. Surely, the Archduke thought that explained why the girl was so happy. Although Searia was intrigued whether that was all he thought. Given the magnitude of the relic's value and strength, wouldn't the Archduke want her to return it? However, Rush was not in the habit of taking off gifts. Besides, he thought the necklace suited Searia much better. Not expecting that answer, the heroine looked at him surprised, with wide eyes. After that, she stood up abruptly on the bench, determined to resume the glacier inspections the following week. The hero thought she wanted to monopolize all matters concerning his servants, which, in Searia's opinion, didn't sound so bad, as she liked it more when the people around her didn't look down on her. And the heroine was sure the Archduke thought the same, which left the hero petrified. Looking closely at the young woman, it seemed very strange to him that she had changed so suddenly. And completely. The next day, surprising the Archduke, Searia decided to meet with the imprisoned magicians who were now being interrogated in the torture room. The Archduke didn't understand her wishes, but the heroine was sure that those priests had come to the castle with a particular objective. She expected to see the magicians battered after the torture, but was surprised to realize that their condition was quite acceptable. Smiling, Lenin considered that Burkov's interrogation methods were not as brutal as the mistress might have thought. Approaching the grate, the heroine called out to the magicians, and they immediately stared fixedly at her. She took out the diadem and showed it to the prisoners, wondering if they had perhaps come for it. Upon seeing the ornament, the magicians seemed to go crazy, and one of them ran towards the grate. But Rush managed to pull Searia away from there. Hitting the bars, the magician exhaled deeply, and at that moment, the previously pulled-out teeth fell from his mouth. Terrified and hastily starting to collect them, Lenin was perplexed, as the prisoners were supposed to keep their mouths shut. Putting the teeth back into the magician's mouth, the hero wanted him to obey. And stop scaring the mistress. The heroine was shocked, as according to Lenin, they hadn't used violent methods. But the hero only smiled, while Rush quickly took her away from there. Later, Elliot reported to the Archduke that everything was the work of Mitchell, whose approach was much harsher than they had thought. Upon learning this, Rush became furious, recalling how angry that wretch was upon discovering he was an illegitimate son. The Archduke didn't understand. Did his brother perhaps think that destroying House Burkov would change the fact of his birth? Searia, sitting opposite, remembered that according to Lenin, Mitchell had been the favorite of the previous Archduke. And if he had now hired armed shamans, it meant he had truly lost his mind. However, the heroine didn't understand why Rush's brother needed the sacred relic. These thoughts were interrupted by the Archduke, who decided to clarify that he absolutely did not hide any illegitimate children. But Searia perfectly knew that he would never do that, which surprised Rush. After all, receiving a compliment from the heroine was a rare occurrence, which left the girl perplexed. Suddenly, the Archduke felt that something had happened between Elliot and Searia. The girl tried to hide it with all her might, so now she was surprised how Rush had discovered it. That morning, Elliot arrived early at her chambers, determined to thank her in person for saving the Laurel estate. Kneeling and crying, he thought that now his life and honor, previously belonging to the estate, now belonged to Searia. The heroine was not surprised that such deep feelings arose in him, as Marta's place should have been occupied by him. Perplexed by her silence, Rush began to get angry, but suddenly Lenin ran to them with urgent news. It turned out that a group of priests, including the high priest, headed to the main cathedral. But they were overtaken by a blizzard and monstrous creatures. Marquis Hennet and Saint Lena were also with them, which only confused the heroes more. An urgent message was received, indicating that Mrs. Searia and the night squadron must leave immediately. However, at that moment, it was not known how serious the danger was. So Rush decided to send them in response to freeze to death. If they really needed help, they should send knights led by Elliot. Searia knew that he probably refused to do so to avoid putting her in a difficult situation. However, she knew that refusing the high priest's request would negatively affect House Burkov. And since the heroine swore to do everything possible for him, she didn't want the main cathedral to start being hostile towards the Burkes. So, addressing His Highness, she was determined to leave to help. Linan looked at her with grateful puppy eyes, while the Archduke was perplexed. Approaching Searia and leaning over her, Rush thought it was unnecessary for her to go, since he could invent 100 excuses. He knelt down and offered her his hand, deciding that if she wanted to go, at least they could go together. Taking his hand, Searia smiled and gave her consent, looking him directly in the eyes. Meanwhile, Elliot and Linan were petrified, not understanding what they had just witnessed. After some time, the knight entourage led by Rush and Searia arrived at the scene of the incident. The Primate of Lammas came out to meet them in person, thanking them for their response to the request for help. The heroine greeted timidly, remembering how severe and fearsome that man was. But to her surprise, Elamos lit up with a warm and kind smile, thinking that she had matured a lot. Something unexpected for him. She didn't even know what to say, stunned to receive a compliment from someone so demanding. Seeing the shyness in her eyes, Rush stood in front of the young woman, deciding to ask the primate how serious the threat from those monsters was. Then Lamos invited the Archduke to his tent, while Searia could wait in her chambers. Turning to her, Rush wished to know if the heroine was willing to stay alone for a while. At that moment, the young woman experienced the same shock as all the knights behind her. Blushing red as a tomato, she didn't want Rush to treat her like a child, although the hero considered that place very dangerous. Smiling, he decided that later they would have a chance to meet with their dear mistress. She blushed even more, not understanding why he was suddenly so courteous. In any case, a few minutes later, she ended up in her room. Not far away were Collies and Lena, and the heroine would give anything to avoid meeting them. Nevertheless, she knew that, since Lena was the protagonist, they would have to see each other before the mission anyway. Suddenly, the saint ran to her tent, convinced that she had already heard everything. Looking attentively at Searia, Lena was sure that the heroine had come here to save her. While the saint babbled words of gratitude, Searia didn't understand what she was saying. The saint was convinced that the heroine couldn't even imagine how scared she was. Upon getting out of bed, Searia tried to convince her, as she had come here at the request of the high priest, not to save her. However, even if that were the case, the saint was so grateful that tears welled up in her eyes. But suddenly, Lena's gaze fell upon the heroine's neck, and at that moment, her face changed drastically. The saint was intrigued by what necklace hung on Searia, which left the girl perplexed. The heroine didn't understand why the object had interested the saint so much, since everything was different in the book. Adopting a serious tone and pointing at Searia with her finger, Lena demanded an explanation of where she got the necklace. Remembering that in the original version it belonged to the saint, the heroine confessed it was a gift from the Archduke. Thinking it was a wedding gift, Dina suddenly screamed and became hysterical. Upon hearing that the saint wanted one just like it, Sarai became completely disconcerted by what was happening. Something definitely didn't add up, since why would the saint express such a desire? At that moment, immersed in her thoughts, Lena suddenly reached a logical conclusion. With a mocking smile, she decided that the protagonist would return the Archduke's gift immediately after the divorce. A few seconds earlier, Calliz was heading towards Sarai's tent. The guard was very surprised that Marquis Hennet had decided to visit the protagonist. Suddenly, they heard Lena's voice, who stated that Sarai should return the Archduke's gift after the divorce. Meanwhile, the protagonist was completely perplexed by what she heard. This Lena in front of her now bore no resemblance to her book character. Ostentatiously showing the necklace, Sarai supposed that the saint wished to obtain it for herself. With a sweet smile, Lena acted as if it were simply very beautiful. And if the girl was bored with that object, the saint would be delighted to receive it from Sarai as a birthday gift. Suddenly, an authoritative male voice ordered the saint to stop immediately, which paralyzed her. Upon seeing the Marquis enter the tent, the protagonist immediately suppressed the urge to vomit. Turning around and seeing him, fear and confusion immediately appeared in the saint's eyes. Collies was furious, unable to understand how Lena could speak so calmly about the divorce of two aristocrats from Imperia Gyru. Finally disoriented, the saint started to deny everything, throwing frightened glances between the hero and Searia. Suddenly, Lena concluded that she said it like that because, upon her divorcing Callus, Searia would annul her marriage with Rouge. Then the Marquis could finally be with Searia, but even so, Callus considered her words extremely repulsive. Blushing with shame, the saint looked at him resentfully, as if she had just betrayed him. Deciding she had understood enough, Lena left Zimming, under the astonished cries of collies calling her. Observing them, the heroine was surprised that they had decided to have a family argument in her presence. Upon casting his gaze on her, the Marquis was horrified, convinced that Searia had lost too much weight. However, according to the young woman, that didn't concern him and he could calmly approach Lena. The Marquis tried to apologize again, but suddenly an alarm sounded announcing a monster attack. Collies immediately turned to the heroine, horrified upon hearing the news. A few minutes later, a bloody battle began, and the knights tried to remain within Stern's area of influence. Standing on a promontory and observing the fight, Searia noticed that there were many more monsters than she had imagined. But now they had to concentrate, as Stern's power reached the constellation Steel within 5 kilometers. If a knight stepped outside that radius, his armor would rapidly draw heat from the wearer until he died of hypothermia. That's why, during the battle with the monsters, Stern and the knights had to be extremely careful. Suddenly, Searia heard a roar and, turning around, saw a gigantic monster launching itself towards her. Suddenly, collies appeared between them, who stopped the monster's attack and protected the heroine. Seeing that he could barely contain the monster's attack, the knights immediately rushed to the Marquis's aid. Surprised by what happened, Searia didn't understand why he had risked his life. At that moment, collies diverted his attention from the battle and looked at the young woman, hoping she was all right. The monster decided to take advantage of this and suddenly attacked the Marquis from behind. But suddenly Ruch appeared, who jumped into the air and landed on the monster, pinning it to the ground with his sword. Looking furiously at the bewildered Marquis, the Archduke was shocked to see that he couldn't even take care of himself. Seeing him, Searia felt deep relief and cheerfully greeted her husband. Looking at her, the Archduke became furious and lunged towards her immediately. He decided that everyone only talked about Stern's worth, but they dared to allow her to fall to the ground. On the verge of death, the young woman didn't understand how he knew she was in danger, but hugging her, Rush concluded that he had simply felt it. Searia tried to calm him down by saying she was here and unharmed, even though the Archduke could have strangled her with his hugs. Rush decided that if she had died, he would bury alive all the nobles who asked him for help. Staring intently into his wife's eyes, Rush didn't even want to imagine what could have happened if he hadn't arrived in time. The heroine wished to end these dramatic dialogues, as people were watching them. But the Archduke didn't care. Looking at them with envy and sadness in his heart, collies didn't understand when those two managed to get so close. Holding his sword, the Marquis suddenly felt an immensely strong desire to stick it into Rush. But suddenly, Lynn called him as she ran towards him from the other end of the battlefield. Seeing the Marquis's hand, the saint was horrified and decided to immediately heal his wound. The Archduke considered her crazy. How could Stern abandon her position in formation? Condemning her for leaving her post, the priests began to forcibly drag her back, suppressing her attempts to break free. At that moment, another priest approached the Marquis and began to heal his hand. Later, Amos reprimanded the saint, who clearly hadn't considered the training she had received. The Sterns played a key role in the battle against the monsters, so they could not leave their knights under any pretext. Especially because of one of them, with whom she had no relationship. What would the saint be doing right now if the knights of House Burkov had frozen during her absence? She bowed her head resignedly. Lynn cried, apologizing for what happened, convinced that she simply hadn't thought about it. Deciding to end the reprimands, Imoz hoped that from now on she would maintain composure so that the battle against the monsters would proceed smoothly. After that, finally alone, the saint changed sadness for anger. With her teeth clenched from distress, Lynn didn't understand. Had she done something wrong? Surely Searia would have acted the same. So, why was she treated like this precisely? Wiping away her tears, the saint decided to make the high priest go through the same terrible experience. And to the heroine. During the next battle, Abigail took care of the monsters, killing one after another. Feeling a strong cold, she turned around, believing she had moved too far away from her mistress. Suddenly, the soldier next to her warned the warrior of an attack from the right. But upon looking in that direction, Abby was surprised not to see anyone. Noticing movement at the last moment, she managed to repel the creature's attack, which turned out to be from the left. Realizing something strange was happening, she headed towards the shouting knight, scaring him by approaching. Upon arriving and staring at him, the woman wanted to know what plans that rascal was hiding. Grabbing his shirt, she suddenly understood that, all this time, it had been that soldier who was leading her further and further away from Stern. And every time monsters attacked, he pretended to help her while diverting all threats towards her. Looking at the knight's face, Abby remembered that it was precisely he who followed her, sticking to the saint like glue. Finally furious, she didn't even understand if it was Lena who had given him those orders. Meanwhile, the saint walked cheerfully through the camp, wondering if the soldier had fulfilled his assignment. She dreamed that everyone would be just as kind and agree without question to help her. Suddenly, Rush appeared in front of Lena, walking in the opposite direction. As he passed by her side, the saint felt a strange sensation, like an electric shock. Suddenly, the hero stopped, while Lena couldn't understand what that had been. Turning towards her, the Archduke wanted to know why he had left a mark on her hand. Looking at him stunned, the saint knew for certain that she hadn't done anything. But Rush didn't understand how he could then explain the wound that appeared on his hand after passing by her side. Understanding nothing, Lena began to deny her participation in the appearance of that wound. The Archduke looked at her coldly and began to walk away, hoping the saint wouldn't bother him anymore. At that moment, Lena felt her entire body trembling just from his presence. Now she considered that she had made the right choice and that Kali's was indeed the best option. But barely minutes later, all her joy disappeared when she found herself in the primate's tent. Searia and Evie were there, as well as the captured soldier he used to move the knight away from the heroine. Grabbing the knight by the shoulder, Amos wanted to hear directly from the saint whether it was true that she sent that warrior to hinder Lady Abigail. Not understanding how it could have happened, Lena trembled with fear, not knowing what to say. She only wanted His Eminence to understand her correctly, so Amos completely lost patience and started to yell at her. Although crying inconsolably, Lena decided that she just wanted to prove that anyone would abandon their post for someone they care about. Even Searia. The heroine was horrified to hear that the saint had risked her knight's life for something so insignificant. She was aware that a knight leaving the range of the Stern ran the risk of dying easily. With clenched fists and horrified by what he heard, the high priest decided that he could no longer ignore such faults. Until now, the saint had to complete a month of service in the Supreme Church before being able to go to the capital. But now, Imos decided to cancel it and detain Lena in the church, which terrified her. Unable to contain herself, the saint screamed that she hated him, and the high priest understood that her comfort was her priority. In a fit of desperation, Lena started insulting Abigail, whom no one felt sorry for, since they had already imprisoned her, which infuriated Amos even more. Screaming that they didn't understand anything and that she just wanted to open their eyes to the truth, the saint ran out of the tent. Watching her leave, Searia hoped the chief priest would allow her to speak with her in private. Hiding behind the rocks, Lena cried inconsolably over the unjust reproach from everyone, instead of receiving praise. She didn't understand what she had done wrong and blamed Searia for everything, who, in her opinion, had taken her place. Suddenly, the saint heard a voice, longing to obtain more divine power. At that moment, she saw in front of her the same necklace that the Archduke had gifted his wife. The object floating in the air wished for the saint to touch it immediately. Extending her hand, Lena tried to grab the necklace, which was already begging her to take it. As soon as it fell into the saint's hands, currents of dark energy surrounded her body. and began to penetrate it. It all happened before the heroine's eyes, who was shocked by such a spectacle. Not understanding what was happening, Searia watched as Dina rose into the air and, absorbing the dark energy, fell to the ground. Looking at her, Lena's face distorted with anger and fear, and her eyes filled with fury. At that very moment, the saint jumped from the spot and ran to escape. Unable to catch up, Searia decided to call the primate first. Later, upon learning that the saint had fled, Rush decided that she was mocking them, committing endless nonsense. Looking furiously at the clergyman who had reported everything, the Archduke didn't understand what they directly wanted from him. Trembling with fear, the servant hoped that His Excellency would assign them his knights. It turned out the situation was urgent, and the primate himself decided to search for the saint along with Searia. Upon hearing this, the Archduke went crazy, glaring at the clergyman. Meanwhile, following Lena's track, Amo was enraged by always having to receive the saint. But everything ended the same way. At that moment, the heroine remembered the currents of dark energy. She didn't understand what they were, or if she should inform the primate about them. Most likely, Searia thought they were demonic shadows, and perhaps Lena was trying to purify them. Suddenly, they ran into the saint, standing in the middle of a small clearing. Upon seeing them, Lena got very scared. She demanded that they not approach, and decided that she had done nothing wrong. Emos approached carefully, wishing to return to camp and discuss everything first. If the saint abandons her post, then the real problems will begin. Suddenly, behind the saint appeared a giant monster that looked furiously at the heroes. Before, the search party led by Rush tried desperately to find traces of the missing. Looking into the distance, the Archduke didn't understand where Searia could have gone. Suddenly, Kali's approached, who wanted to know if His Highness had found any traces of the heroine. Angrily, Rush decided that at a time like this, the Marquis shouldn't worry about her. Has the hero lost his mind with the saint if he already put the Archduchess in a dangerous place? And yet, the Marquis continues to cause trouble, which infuriated the Archduke greatly. At that moment, a soldier ran to them, reporting a new monster that had just appeared. Meanwhile, Emos tried to protect the saint, but the monster jumped on him and crushed him against the ground. Bleeding under the monster's attack, the primate wished that Lena would manage to escape. At that very moment, the monster began to mercilessly tear his flesh, right before Lena's eyes. But the saint couldn't move from fear, and upon seeing her, the monster raised its claw to strike. But at the last moment, Rush appeared, who knocked down the monster with a single blow, protecting Lena. He looked furiously at the saint. The hero didn't understand. Hadn't it been clear to her that he didn't want any more trouble? Still shocked by what happened, Lena barely managed to utter words of gratitude. Suddenly, a gigantic moon illuminated the sky, causing panic in the saint. Currents of energy began to envelop and lift her, so the young woman began to scream desperately. Desperately, she reached out her hand to Rush and begged heartbreakingly for help. Uncertain, the Archduke extended his hand, trying to save her. But Lena's body was completely absorbed by the magic. Rush stood motionless, perplexed, looking at the empty silhouette the saint left behind. Horrified, the heroine understood that this was happening for the second time. In the story, Lena had returned to her world through the moon on several occasions. And although the first time was brief, the second time was different. Not only did it last a whole year, but it also made Rush and Callies recognize their love for the saint, something they hadn't perceived before. What happened was an omen of the main story that Searia was trying to avoid. Although the location and circumstances of the disappearances differed completely, something remained the same. As in the novel, the Archduke and Lena drew closer to each other, initiating their feelings. And now, seeing it with her own eyes, the heroine didn't know what to do. Do I really just have to watch the story unfold? And is it really impossible to avoid a future where Rausch and Lena fall in love with each other, and Searia dies as a villain? After some time, the priests buried Amos and the heroine went to pray for him. The servants were very grateful, thinking that thanks to the prayer of someone like Stern, he was surely already in the divine embrace. Suddenly, Searia heard Rush's voice, who asked her what she was doing there. It turned out that the girl had come to place a lock of her hair on the lid of the archbishop's coffin. It was considered useful for the deceased, and the archduke decided to do it himself, so that Searia wouldn't see Amos in that state. Later, the heroine noticed that due to Lena's disappearance and the archbishop's death, all the night seemed quite desolate. She didn't remember that, in the original romance, Amos had such an imminent death. The only thing Searia knew for sure was that Lena hadn't disappeared there, but near a frozen lake. After Rush followed her there, the Archduke felt guilty for her disappearance, which he couldn't prevent even though she was nearby. The feeling of guilt towards her gradually changed, and after a year, turned into love. That's why Searia decided to ask him directly if he felt guilty for what happened. Surprised by the question, the hero didn't understand in front of whom and why he felt guilty. The heroine didn't want to interrogate him, but Rush insisted and clarified if he felt guilty towards the saint. Although he didn't manage to save her, Lin was very close, but Searia never accused him. The Archduke was surprised to see how the protagonist believed he could feel similar emotions. Placing his hand on her face, he was happy to discover why Searia had frowned so much. That's why the inner corners of her eyebrows were raised, and he began to massage them carefully. Searia tried to deny everything, but Rush understood her feelings just by looking at her expression. However, he didn't feel guilty, since the saint had decided to escape the camp on her own. And he didn't force her. The protagonist was confused, as every time she tried to change the plot, everything ended the same as in the script. The worst part was that her desperate actions led to the death of a completely innocent person. Later, sitting on a bench, Searia saw a temple boy who offered her a tribute in honor of the deceased. Gratefully, she accepted the cup full of wine that the boy handed her. Looking at the bright liquor, she thought she had never managed to clear things up with Rush. The Archduke considered that the priest's death deeply impacted the protagonist. She hoped he wasn't angry with her and decided to ask his forgiveness. Suddenly, Collies appeared out of nowhere and snatched the cup from Searia's hands, not allowing her to drink that wine. Instead, he handed her a bottle full of something that, according to him, she would like. The girl insisted on reclaiming the canteen and getting her cup back, but the Marquis simply poured the wine on the ground. It was made of strawberries, and Callies knew perfectly well that Sirius was allergic to them. Turning around and starting to walk away, he also wanted her to keep the canteen. Furious, the protagonist decided to throw it away, when suddenly she heard Elliot's voice behind her. He had just prepared the carriage and had come to take the lady. He became interested in where she got the canteen from. And the protagonist lied, saying that a vagrant had given it to her. However, upon seeing the hennet crest, Elliot understood that it was a gift from the Marquis. Terrified, Sirius feared that if anyone else found out, a scandal could break out. The knight discovered that Collies had given her different wine, as the priests had prepared hers with strawberries, which the protagonist was allergic to. Looking closely at the lady, Elliot thought the master would be disappointed to find out. Moreover, he now understood why His Highness always insisted on accompanying Sirius. Seeing the boy who had been with her, the protagonist hurried to return the canteen to him, hoping he would return it to the Marquis. Suddenly, Rausch's hand snatched it from her fingers, leaving her perplexed. Leaning towards her, the Archduke wanted to know what and to whom she intended to return it. Understanding that that scoundrel Genet had flirted with his wife again, Rausch became furious. Meanwhile, the priest greeted Marquis Genet in the tent, wishing to deliver an urgent message from the High Church. Collies decided that if they couldn't wait to find out when he would arrive, they wouldn't have to wait long, since he planned to leave today. However, the church wanted a witness to accompany him, which left the Marquis perplexed. Since the saint herself has disappeared, the matter will be thoroughly investigated. They need someone with strong divine power, who was present at the moment of the saint's disappearance, and who will go with him to the church. The elders held a meeting and decided that Esterna should go. The Marquis thought he would have to take her there, but the priests decided to take care of it themselves. They understood that Searia and Collies would not be happy with each other's presence, and wanted to do everything possible to prevent them from crossing paths. Suddenly, Raj's powerful voice called Kali's, and the Marquis barely managed to catch the bottle flying towards his face. Standing at the entrance with a calm expression, the Archduke wanted them to continue their conversation. However, looking furiously at the priest, he also wanted to clarify who and where they had decided to take. First of all, Rush didn't understand who had the authority to give such orders. The hero believed that his wife had already overcome many difficulties on the way home. Upon learning that Searia had no time for a trip to the church, the Marquis got angry. If they needed someone with divine power, Rush was willing to go himself, being part of Grand Vanchette. Suddenly, the Marquis thought that the Archduke didn't want to let the protagonist go, since he had given her an inhuman amount of work. Smiling in return, Rush thanked the Marquis for his interest in his wife. Since Callies had always been with the saint, his attitude towards Searia was like that. A moment before, upon taking the bottle of hennet from the protagonist, the Archduke decided that she would be better off drinking something decent than this straw. But it turned out that the girl could not drink the local wine due to her allergy to strawberries. Searia understood that the hero didn't know, as they had spent little time together. And she hadn't been able to tell him. Rush found it amusing that the Marquis knew more about the Archduchess than the Archduke himself. Was it all because she had known him for longer? That's why Kali's face distorted with emotions every time he was mentioned. Approaching the Marquis, Rush decided that he had forgotten that his wife was the saint. Not Searia. But Kali's was sure that he had married Lena only due to unforeseen circumstances. Just like with the protagonist. However, the Archduke believed that everything was different, since he had never run away from his fiancée at the wedding for an affair with another. Taking his sword, Kali supposed that Ruch would stop insulting him if he challenged him to a duel. Pleased with the worthy proposal, the Archduke accepted it enthusiastically, which terrified the priest. The priest tried to reason with them, as something bad could happen, but precisely that was what Ruch needed. So, the priest decided that they should consider the lady, who is already suffering from Margress's death, and that a fight would finish killing her. Relieved, this argument proved convincing, and the heroes decided to postpone the steals for now. Upon arriving at that moment, Elliot saw Rush and Collies putting away their swords and didn't understand what they intended to do. The Archduke just smiled disdainfully, ordering the knight to assign some of the soldiers accompanying him to the temple. Rush also wanted Elliot to personally verify that all strawberries in the main garden of the place were uprooted. The Archduke wasn't sure if Searia knew, but no one tortured him as much as she did. With eyes full of amazement, Collies realized, horrified, that the Archduke was in love with Searia. Upon returning to the place and finding the garden completely dug up, the heroine thought she was dreaming. Looking at the state in horror, Abby supposed that someone had looted the place, although Searia immediately dismissed that possibility. However, the warrior was so sure of her assumption that, drawing her sword, she prepared to find and punish the person responsible. Meanwhile, they entered the building, where Bastian and other servants received them. The heroine immediately noticed that the place seemed fine, although she didn't understand what had happened in the yard. It turned out that they had decided that the strawberries had multiplied too much, and they had to dig everything up to extract every root. But Searia still didn't understand why they left the garden like that. And she discovered that the gardeners only obeyed her orders. By tradition, the lands of the place belonged to the Archduchess, but since it hadn't had an owner for a long time, the gardeners worked reluctantly. Upon learning this, Bastian thought that Searia herself could take the opportunity and give the garden a new look. Understanding that there was no other alternative, and that she had to finish it before Rouge arrived, the heroine gave her consent. The first thing that occurred to her was that there was no need to follow a schedule, and that the amount of work was considerable, which already alerted Bastian. After 3 days, upon learning from Marta that she would be sent to Oral, Searia didn't understand the reason. She worked very hard and put in their place the gardeners who tried to deceive her, and consequently to the Burkov home. Furthermore, Searia carefully studied 24 garden design proposals and selected the most beautiful one, and reasonable in price. The butler considered that everything had been resolved for the main plot. and wished the lady would travel to Oral. After all, she had performed a tremendous amount of work in 3 days. And he hoped it would become her relaxing hobby. And at that moment, while finishing her tea, Searia concluded that they were really exiling her for working too fast. Marta understood Bastian and noticed that the lady had lost considerable weight. So she hoped she would come for dinner on weekends. Hugging the heroine, she decided that his lordship should also come, since according to the butler, Roch wasn't resting enough. While they were on the plot, no one had noticed how hard the master worked. That's why Marta now hoped he would find peace in his heart. After 2 days, upon returning from Oral, Searia again remembered the maid's words. And that Lena should return after a year. The heroine was intrigued whether the events were progressing as in the book. Then, when she returned, Rush would give her his heart. Before, Searia believed she was ready for any turn of events. But after Kali's betrayal, she felt bad. Moreover, it turned out to be incomprehensible what darkness had entered Lena's body. Who was a saint and the incarnation of light itself? She was chosen by a god and possessed his strength, while the protagonist could only purify shadows thanks to the necklace's power. Suddenly, she remembered that the saint began to perform miracles exactly when she obtained this jewel. According to Lena, she did it with her own strength. But what if the necklace empowered Stern and constituted the source of the saint's power? Thinking that, in that case, Lena in the original story was directly lying, the protagonist understood that everything had definitively become confusing. Tired of reflecting, the protagonist didn't know whether to continue basing the plot development on the original one. Finally, back at the manor, the first person she met upon getting out of the cart was the Archduke, who came out specifically to greet her. Searia was surprised, and at the same time glad that he had returned so quickly from the high church. And it turned out that the protagonist galloped at full speed the whole time. Sensing an unbearable heat instead of a pleasant warmth, the protagonist feared that Rush might have managed to get sick. The Archduke didn't understand. Did he look sick? But Searia considered that anyone could get sick. Rush agreed, but today he couldn't afford to slack off, as there was a lot of pending work. Later, upon hearing her supposition that the Archduke might be sick, Lenin considered it impossible, as he had always been in perfect condition. Searia understood that if even Lenin claimed he was healthy, there couldn't be anything serious. So, she decided to find out where His Highness was now to show him the plan for the future garden. It turned out he was in his rooms, since, due to the haste of his departure from the high church, he had pending matters. Sensing that something was wrong, she immediately went to see him and found him completely exhausted. Now she was sure that Lenin had been very naive, and that the Archduke had always hidden his illness even from him. As soon as the girl thought that she urgently needed medicine, Rush suddenly grabbed her hand. However, the hero's gaze remained clouded, and his face was paler than paper. Searia called him at once, hoping he would regain consciousness, and to her relief, Rush woke up. In any case, he was right. And Rush had a fever, despite pretending. Taking out the pill she had received from Suzette, the protagonist offered it to the Archduke, hoping he would take it and go to sleep. But Rush thought he might melt just from her touch. So Searia deduced that he knew she had a fever. The hero thought he shouldn't touch the pill and hoped the girl would help him take it. He moved close to Searia's palm and took the pill with his mouth, directly from her hand. Afterward, he wanted her to bring him water, as the pill might leave a bitter taste. Holding the glass of water so he could drink, the protagonist reminded herself that he was only sick. And she shouldn't worry. Suddenly, she accidentally spilled some water on his chin, which Rush did not like. But Searia didn't want to hear complaints, as few can receive Stern's attention personally. So the hero decided he would bow to her later. The protagonist didn't understand why he had gotten into that state, but according to Rush, she also didn't spare herself and worked without rest. However, the girl wouldn't have hidden her condition to remain the same. The Archduke was intrigued whether she looked so desperate that she felt obliged to stay with him. But Searia simply knew that when a person is sick, they can feel very lonely. Rush was intrigued whether she knew from experience and that she was treated badly at home. but in reality, she was the one who treated everyone badly. So, the hero remembered that he had sent an envoy to her family to ask for approval of their marriage after the party. But they were not in a hurry to respond. According to Searia, her parents simply didn't care about her marriage. And if Kali's had been a duke, they would have also found heaps of reasons to reject him. Because they believed she deserved no more than a marriage with a marquis, and they would never accept their daughter being an archduchess. So Rush wanted to end the conversation about the Kelidans because deep down, the answer wasn't that important to him. But Searia didn't understand why he had even sent an envoy to her estate. It turned out that he was the only man who had obtained permission to marry the heroine. And now he constantly boasted. Therefore, there was nothing to worry about, because the Archduke simply wanted to fulfill the formalities. This calmed Searia a little, and the hero was intrigued whether she would be free tomorrow or the day after. The girl immediately agreed, deciding that it wasn't even worth asking. And it turned out that Rush wanted to go somewhere with her, specifically to the lake where she goes to inspect, but not from the north side she was used to, but from the south, which was much more beautiful. The last few days had been tense, and according to the Archduke, resting by the lake was the best option to relax a little. Searia was only bothered by the possibility of monsters appearing, but Rush knew that the guests were accompanied by knights. So there was no reason to worry. Taking her hand and looking into her eyes softly, the Archduke thought that if he was there, she shouldn't even worry. However, the protagonist decided that first she had to bring down his fever, upon noticing how red his eyes were. Surprised by her words, the protagonist was sure that his eyes had always been like that. Suddenly, she realized that her eyes were indeed red by nature, not understanding why she hadn't noticed it before. The protagonist hoped that Searia could go with him to the lake, and to his relief, she accepted. The majestic view of the ice-covered lake was a rare sight on this continent. Upon meeting the protagonist and seeing the umbrella in her hands, Rush didn't understand since when she liked them so much. It turned out that, according to the maid, the light reflected on the snow could be blinding. That's why all the guests carried umbrellas. She also learned from her thirst that the frozen lake was popular among newlyweds. On clear days, couples carried umbrellas symbolizing blooming flowers around the lake. But at that moment, standing in front of Rush and very blushingly, Searia thought that the maid shouldn't have mentioned it, pretending that it seemed strange to her. The protagonist tried to hide the umbrella, but the Archduke unexpectedly stopped her, since he knew that the maids were right, and that view could really be blinding. So, the protagonist suddenly expressed the desire for him to stand under her umbrella with her. The sun shone too intensely. Besides, there was enough space under it for two people. The Archduke thanked her for her concern and enthusiastically accepted the proposal. While observing the lake next to him, Searia remembered that, according to rumors, if you looked at the glacier frequently, you could fall in love with the Duchy of Berk. Surprised, Rush discovered that she had learned this from her set before coming here. Then he wondered if the protagonist at that moment felt like she was falling in love. It turned out she wasn't deceiving him, since she was stern and knew perfectly well that she was on the other side of the glacier. Turning to look elsewhere, the Archduke considered that the young woman remained a great mystery to him. However, Searia felt like an open notebook. While they were there, dark energy clouds suddenly appeared around the lake. Floating in the air, they began to be absorbed into the ice, gradually darkening it, which left the protagonist stunned. Becoming suddenly serious, Rush didn't understand why it had started right now. The protagonist remembered this phenomenon of the darkened lake, as it was frequently mentioned in the book. Every winter, the frozen lake turns black and then returns to its normal state. But there were also times when, along with the color change, monsters suddenly appeared around the lake. That's why, walking with his wife through the garden, the Archduke decided that they would spend the next week at the palace, observing the situation. Upon accepting, Searia considered that there was nothing to fear, since everything would resolve itself in a week. However, Rush decided that she was still scared because of the depressed look she had when they sat down for lunch. He wouldn't like her to cry again, and for the protagonist to think he likes to make fun of her. He moved his hand away and thought that he had been very kind to show her his garden, which she wanted to see so much. Rush hurried to calm her, as he hadn't yet had time to see the design she had chosen. He wanted Searia to show and explain everything to him while they were there. "What do you plan to do?" Searia considered planting an oak, but hesitated, considering it old-fashioned, although the protagonist wished she would do whatever she wanted. Ironically, she looked at Rush and wondered what he would say if she wanted to plant an oak tree on the palace roof. However, the protagonist didn't understand. Did she have the right to contradict the Archduchess? So she decided to plant a tree directly in her rooms, which left the Archduke perplexed. Unexpectedly, he laughed sincerely and wholeheartedly. Looking at him, Searia began to think that lately the protagonist had been laughing frequently. She remembered that Marta had asked her to visit on weekends and wished that the Archduke, if possible, would accompany her. She knew in advance that the Archduke had a lot of work, but unexpectedly accepted her invitation. Suddenly, Lenin appeared from the palace, running desperately towards the lady. He apologized for interrupting their walk, but it turned out that a servant from the Leiden house had arrived, wishing to deliver a funeral announcement. Upon learning that Mrs. Margaret, Searia's aunt, had passed away, the protagonist remembered that woman. The lady never married or had children, but her long time as head of the family gave her a lot of power. Furthermore, she was the only relative of Searia who never showed hostility towards her. The protagonist knew that the lady loved the theater very much and treated actors well. That's why she felt no resentment towards Searia's biological mother. She left her an inheritance, and it was up to the young woman to travel to the family home that week. Rush decided to send Lenin instead, but the protagonist didn't want to indulge his whims. And her father personally invited her. In reality, it was a good opportunity, and Searia remembered how she met her relatives at a party. Of course, the protagonist knew that Searia's relations with her family were horrible. But having lived in her body, she decided to improve the bonds. However, it didn't work out, and she still remembered that feeling she experienced then. It wasn't anger, but an incredible fear that made her whole body tremble. At that moment, overwhelmed by her emotions, she simply fled, as if she were the real Searia. Now, having lived in her body for so long, the protagonist wanted to test whether she could control her emotions in front of her relatives. Rush wanted to accompany her, but she was surprised. Was he perhaps afraid to leave her alone? However, if he truly cared about her, he could do something for her, something Searia whispered in his ear. After a while, the protagonist successfully arrived at Kelleiden's place, accompanied by her knights. Upon learning from the butler, Nizos, the second son of the Kelleiden house, he would be surprised, as he believed she would fear the father and wouldn't come. Upon learning that his brother received the head of the Mensu house, and that the father and the mother were also busy, he didn't suspect, should he perhaps receive her himself. Finally, the butler personally went out onto the street to greet Mrs. Searia Kelleiden. Smiling in response, the protagonist was glad to see Jason, who hadn't changed at all after so many years. The butler agreed that it had been a long time since they saw each other, and hoped the lady was well. It was like that until the house treated her with disdain, something that bewildered Jason. First, she was no longer Kelleiden, but the Archduchess of Berkia, and he should greet her according to her rank. However, she had to enter through the side gates instead of the main ones. And moreover, it was the butler, not a relative, who greeted her. The young woman thought that, in his eyes, she must look like a postman, after which Jason began to apologize desperately. However, Searia had no intention of repeating it, and immediately sent him back to report on her arrival. When the butler fled, she decided to ask Abby if that treatment was an unbearable insult. The warrior suggested destroying the gates, but the protagonist refused, as they would then have to pay compensation. But Abby was determined to cut in half anyone who dared to ask her mistress for money. Deciding that if necessary she would call the warrior, Searia watched as the place's gates opened again. From among them came out with a displeased expression the eldest son of Marquis Kelleiden, and the protagonist's half-brother, who was one of those who despised her. His name was Cassius, and he was furious, not understanding what devilish tricks this girl was plotting. But the girl decided she had to watch her language, since she was no longer a Keliden. She was now Archduchess, and Cassius had to address her by her title. Surprised by such audacity, the Marquis wondered if he would perhaps have to kneel to greet that aristocratic figure. However, his gestures of respect were unnecessary, but he did have to greet her properly, especially with the knights watching them. What was the point of showing family problems in front of representatives of House Burkov? Disturbed and looking away, Cassius remembered that she had been injured and thought that had changed her. Extending his hand towards her, he wanted Searia to take it and follow him. Upon doing so, the protagonist restrained an attack of fear and tremors, deciding that she was no longer the person they knew. And they had nothing to fear. Later, the butler informed her that the best guest room, in a separate wing, was prepared for her. However, Searia decided she could give it to Abigail, which bewildered Jason. The girl didn't understand why she should use a guest room if she already had her own chambers. Seeing the maids behind him, just standing and watching, she chose to order them to prepare her room. But upon entering, Searia only saw neglect and decay, and a layer of dust accumulated probably since her departure. Now, the protagonist was even happier that her knights did not see this dishonor. From Cash's surprised expression, he also did not know about the state of this room. Enjoying his confusion, Searia decided to surprise him even more. Remember that in the county of Berg, even the coachman's rooms were clearly better. Becoming even more confused, the Marquis decided that thieves had infiltrated here, and he wanted Jason to find them immediately. Looking at him, the protagonist understood that she had hurt Cassius and decided that he was not the only one in a bad mood. Suddenly, Elliot entered, who wanted to inspect the rooms assigned to the lady. Showing him her room, the young woman immediately clarified that such things did not sadden her. In general, the relationship in Burke County has to get used to this, and everyone else treats her exactly like this. Elliot decided that he was very happy to have the lady precisely with them, considering it a great stroke of luck for Burke. He thanked her for choosing his county specifically, and was also sure that others thought the same. That's why the knight wanted to quickly resolve the inheritance issue and return home. Thanking the hero for his warm words, Searia completely agreed with him. A short time later, the protagonist was sitting at a round table in the company of her entire family. Lady Menzel considered the news about Margress's death very unexpected. But even so, many could attend. The lady was a recognized figure, and everyone sitting there received her favor. The mother of the Keliden family was delighted with how smoothly the eldest son's chosen one expressed herself. Many times, they thought their family was very lucky that such a girl became a part of it. The lady remembered that, according to Mrs. Margress's wishes, her funeral would absolutely not be tragic. Looking at Searia, she wondered if she had taken too long to decide who to invite to the ceremony. Now, looking at the protagonist, she was happy to see numerous kind faces sitting at the table. After that, everyone continued eating in a formal atmosphere that quickly bored Searia. She had already heard that the representatives of the Western houses were typical aristocrats who smiled cheerfully, but hid knives behind their backs. According to Lady Menzel, Searia came down to the table much earlier than expected. Since the protagonist treated Cassius like a servant, she decided she would be the last to come down. Lady Menzel concluded that Searia probably loved attracting attention. Knowing that girl's history, the protagonist understood that now it might seem like she was inextricably tied to Cassius. But both he and Nissus would end up falling madly in love with Saint Lena. And when Cassius finds out that Lady Mansell secretly made fun of Lena for stealing her fiancé, he will break off the engagement with her instantly. That's why, seeing such a tragic fate awaiting her, Searia wanted to be kinder to her. But it seems she brings it upon herself. First of all, the heroine decided that she absolutely did not need attention, which surprised the young woman. After all, everyone knew she was the daughter of Marquis Keliden and wife of Archduke Burke. Therefore, Searia was sure that there would be no fool here acting like a child trying to figure out who she was. Lady Menzel wanted to retort rudely, But the lady stopped her, deciding that it was better for the heroine to be kinder to a potential family member. Was the Archduchess not interested in the affairs of House Kelliden, or should they call her Your Highness? Smiling in return, the heroine considered that it would be very appropriate on the Marquise's part. After all, if she had been treated with due consideration, everyone here would behave properly. Turning to the Marquis, whom she hadn't seen since her arrival, she wanted to know if he would agree with her. Frowning, the Marquis wished she wouldn't cause scandals, at least now that they had lost a relative. That would have been possible if she had been a Kelliden, but now in front stood Archduchess Burke. She was escorted by knights of the house, under the command of the commander, so he rejected any disrespect towards her husband's surname. And more importantly, he did not want to become a cause of disagreements between the Burkes and the Kellidens. Coughing, the father decided that she had really changed, and Searia found his gaze very strange. The Marquis recalled that rumors were circulating throughout the empire that she lost consciousness during the wedding ceremony. The heroine tried to accept, but Nissus interrupted her, considering it pure madness. Since she was perfectly fine, he was completely sure that the rumors were lies that needed no verification. Upon learning of the inspection, Sierra understood that her father had received the message about her near death. It turned out that he called her here only to check for himself the veracity of what was said. She was indignant at Nissus's words, according to which the Marquis knew what happened. But he didn't send her even a letter. They don't realize the uncomfortable situation they put her in, being his daughter. And despite the kinship, they were not worried that Sierra bled from her mouth when her divine power went out of control. The father was in shock upon learning that his strength had overflowed. But the protagonist decided she could continue without believing him. In the worst case, they could ask the commander of the Burkov House Knights, a respected man who would not lie. After that, she left the dining room with a slam and walked down the hallway when, suddenly, she heard a shout behind her. Approaching her, Cassius abruptly grabbed her wrist, leaving her paralyzed. The Marquis thought that she surely liked causing a scandal after being absent for so long. However, Sierra knew she hadn't organized anything, but she could have died. And she told the truth. It infuriated her that he himself had seen how Lady Menzel treated her, but he still saw the problem in the sister. She already felt bad after meeting with the whole family, but now, being alone with Cassius, the situation was different. Her eyes clouded with horror, and at that moment, the protagonist clearly understood that the problem was not with the father, but precisely with this guy. Barely standing, she wanted Cassius to let her go immediately. However, the next second, she lost strength, and the heroine started to fall to the ground. But the Marquis held her. Mentally, she wanted to ask him to stop and let her go, or at least scream, but Searia suddenly began to choke from terror. Suddenly, Jason appeared, who grabbed Cassius with both hands and pulled him away from the girl. The butler was indignant about the master's actions, as apparently the lady was still traumatized by what happened. Hearing their conversation, Searia remained in silent shock and didn't understand what the heck was going on. Even the next day, the heroine still couldn't get over what happened. The horror was so great that she couldn't even scream, as if her body were tied with chains. It seemed that something much more serious had happened than they could imagine, and the butler knew all the details. Perhaps if a small investigation were carried out, something could be discovered. These thoughts were interrupted by her father, whom she had gone to see. He wanted to know how much Searia had suffered in the ceremony, since she was still not fully recovered. However, the heroine did not wish to repeat what she had already explained in detail yesterday. If the Marquis didn't believe it, he could consult the archives of the main church. The heroine also wanted to know why her father had not yet responded to the Archbishop's request regarding the approval of their marriage. Confused, the Marquis discovered that it was the first time he had heard of that letter. Turning to the servant, he was shocked to learn that the Archduke had indeed sent that request. However, the servant remembered that when the lady left the house, the Marquis personally ordered that nothing related to her should be brought to him. Getting upset, he decided to get rid of the order and hoped the servant had kept that letter. But it wasn't. Upon learning that he had gotten rid of it, the Marquis became furious, as such an order had never been given. It turns out that Mr. Nissus convinced the servant that there would be no problems with that. The protagonist knew that her brother in the novel hated Searia, but she didn't suspect that he had broken all his ties with his father. In any case, she wished to obtain his consent, since His Highness saved her during the ceremony. Thinking that people truly change in the face of death, the Marquis decided to send his consent. However, Sarai decided to deliver it personally, to which he also agreed. So he decided to wait for her to write, calling the Marquis father. Judging by his expression, that word sounded foreign to the Marquis. Does this mean Searia had never called him that? Did she always call him by his title? Later, attending Margress's funeral, the protagonist was shocked by the assembled crowd. Apparently, the Marquise had worked hard on the invitations, and every guest tried to approach Searia with questions. Suddenly, in the crowd, the protagonist spotted a figure so familiar that it hurt. Convinced that she had imagined it. At that moment, a knight approached her asking for a moment of her attention. He knew that the young lady had been close to the deceased and would understand that her heart must be broken. However, Margaret had ordered a proper funeral, and the stranger hoped they wouldn't cause more sadness to the lady. By pretending to know, Searia understood that the Marquise had kept her away on purpose to tarnish her reputation. During dinner, there will be dancing, and the protagonist planned to offer her arm if the lady didn't have a partner yet. The protagonist thanked him for the invitation, although it would be better for the stranger to keep his distance. Suddenly, collies appeared behind Searia, pretending that they had already agreed to dance. Now, the protagonist understood that she hadn't been mistaken in recognizing a familiar face among the guests. The Marquis wanted to know if the protagonist had any interest in his partner. The stranger immediately backed off, convinced that it wasn't so, and disappeared without a trace. Collies hoped Searia would be cautious, as many here were seduced by Stern's fame. Although she herself knew it. Suddenly, the mother of the Leiden house appeared, happy that the protagonist had met Marquis Hannity. The woman considered it a stroke of luck, as she was sure that the girl would not find a suitable dance partner. But the heir of the Hannitys was more than suitable as a partner for an archduchess. Searia didn't understand where she got that from, and it turned out that no one else here reached his level. Relieved to have brought Elliot, the protagonist decided she already had a partner. Upon hearing that she would dance with the commander of the Burkov House Knights, the Marquise tensed abruptly. Amidst the laughter of the ladies surrounding her, she decided that the Marquis was the best partner for Searia. Because, one way or another, his title was the highest among everyone present. Approaching her, the protagonist knew that the lady would not do her this favor. Upon approaching the Marquise, Searia thought that she only wanted to cause her a scandal by linking her with Marquis Genet. However, if the woman was eager to vent her anger on someone, that should be the patriarch of the family. Then, the smile disappeared from her face, and the ladies beside her felt hurt. Collies immediately followed her, and the protagonist considered that he should at least treat her with respect. Since they were watching, what irritated Searia the most was that he still didn't recognize her rank as Archduchess. The protagonist did not want the young woman to pay attention to the Marquise, considering Searia's behavior extremely generous. In response, the protagonist thought that, like the Marquise, she perfectly knew how difficult it was to restrain oneself after her husband's betrayal. Seeing his silence, Searia decided they had said everything necessary and that the conversation was over. Clenching his fist anxiously, Collies could not reply, feeling only pity for himself. The next day, the priest was happy that Marquis Keliden, along with the children, attended Mrs. Margress's legacy distribution ceremony. Knowing that Searia had chosen a land contract, the father was intrigued whether that would be enough for her. That land was not only an expensive plain, but it was also completely contaminated with demonic energy. Did she want the coral island that Nissus chose, or the necklace that Cassius picked? However, Searia was sincerely satisfied with her choice, convinced that for Stern there was nothing more interesting than land with demonic energy. In reality, she knew that in the original novel that land had been granted to Cassius, who gave it to Saint Lena. Using her power, she cleansed that land, and discovered a hidden mine there with valuable magic crystals. The protagonist hoped that, with the diadem, her strength would also be enough for purification. Nissus spat disdainfully, unable to understand what use an abandoned land could be. Searia remained silent, determined not to get into a headache-inducing argument. Since the day before, Cassius and Nissus seemed quite downcast, and she didn't understand what could have happened. After finishing the main matters, the protagonist happily thought that she only had to endure 3 more days. Before dinner started, a servant stood in front of Kelly's room door, wondering how much longer the master planned to stay there. Meanwhile, the Marquis sat in deep despair, surrounded by hatred and resentment. Siria's words about what it felt like to be betrayed by her husband were etched in his mind. He didn't understand how she could have said something like that, and what's more, how she dared to look at him with such an expression. Because in reality, he had never intended to maintain the marriage with Lena. And during all that time, he had only been waiting for the protagonist. His soul seemed to have left his body, convinced that Kali sincerely hated Searia. And if she had betrayed him, then she certainly deserved to die. So the protagonist was paralyzed from lying. An incessant voice began to ring in his mind, demanding that he kill the protagonist immediately. Did the Marquis really want to allow him to act like that towards him forever? He decided that, rather than letting someone else take her, it would be better to actually kill Searia. Looking at the bracelet gifted by the protagonist, Kali felt a burst of fury. Unable to restrain himself, he grabbed the knife and stabbed it into his hand. Pierced by pain and affliction, he began to laugh convulsively, wishing for revenge as soon as possible. Heading to the banquet and opening the door, the protagonist saw Nesusa and involuntarily frowned. The protagonist didn't understand what that reaction was, nor why his sister looked at him like a worm. It turned out that Marquis Genet urgently needed a matter and wanted Nesusa to substitute for him and accompany Searia. The protagonist wanted to know what things the girl had said to the Marquis, for him to still not be able to calm down. Upon hearing his question, Searia understood that he was intrigued whether Kali still felt something for her. It's amazing, but among aristocrats, it is believed that the blame for the end of their engagement lies with him. Although, of course, rumors also circulate that the protagonist was just bored. And he fled. Extending his hand, Nesu tried to accompany his sister to the party, but she deliberately ignored him. Upon arriving at the place, Searia was surprised by the magnitude of the event, thinking that Margris meant a small banquet for close friends. Nesu looked at her silently for a moment, after which he suddenly proposed that she dance. Looking at him angrily, the protagonist thought he must have lost his mind. After all, she had already told everyone that her first dance would be with the cavalry commander of House Burkov. However, Nesu hadn't seen the soldier anywhere, and Searia knew he would hardly show up. At her request, Abby made sure that the butler would not deliver Elliot's suit for the party. She didn't want her brother to accompany her, and decided she could go take care of her business. But it turned out she couldn't. Her father had found out something from someone, and now Nesu, as punishment, had to stay with Searia until the end of the day. So, the protagonist was intrigued whether it was his order to spoil the archbishop's letters. As they glared at each other, they noticed that their mother and Cassius with his girlfriend were approaching them. They wanted Searia to stop acting like a child and finally dance with Nesu. But the young woman was tired of repeating that she had no intention of giving her first dance to her brother. Lady Menzel, with an angry face, didn't understand why Her Highness was behaving like this. Wasn't it enough to humiliate Marquis Hennet by publicly rejecting his accompaniment proposal? At that moment, the guests began to murmur, thinking that Sterna was about to create another scene. The protagonist was confused at first, not understanding where they got all that from. But suddenly Callie's voice was heard, who was also perplexed. Hiding Searia from her family, he thought she just felt unwell and wanted Her Highness to let her rest. At that moment, the protagonist observed the Marquis's left hand, bandaged. She suddenly decided, in front of everyone, that Lady Menzel's words offended him the most. Not expecting such a turn, the girl stood motionless, looking at him fearfully. At that moment, the Marquise demanded that the conversations end immediately. Finally remembering that the celebration was in honor of Mrs. Margraves. Pretending to understand Searia's feelings, the woman wanted her to at least dance with Marquis Hennet. Since she had rejected Nissus, it was not acceptable for the funeral banquet to end under such circumstances. Collies wanted to intervene again, but the protagonist forbade him from doing so. She decided that if she continued like this, malicious rumors would circulate about her and Collies, so she gave her consent. However, before that, she decided to go to a separate room to prepare a little. Once alone, she sat down to adjust her shoes, thinking that both Collies and the Marquis had the gift of turning everything upside down. Eager to return home quickly, the protagonist didn't notice Cassius suddenly entering. Judging by his behavior and words, he understood that her presence was a burden to her. In his opinion, she should have shown at least a little respect, not presenting them poorly in front of everyone. However, Searia thought she had already shown respect by consenting to dance with her. Grabbing his hand, she remembered that upon touching her, she almost lost consciousness. The brother didn't understand. Did she hate him so much because of what happened? The girl understood that he was referring to that incident where Searia hated him. She decided to find out directly from him, pretending not to understand why he acted that way. Perplexed, he didn't understand how much longer he would remember that, since they had decided it was an accident. Suppressing an excess of horror, Searia wanted to know if the protagonist had forgotten what he did. Trying to find out what Cassius was afraid of, she noticed that ignoring the problem wouldn't solve it. Upon hearing that he intended to tell the father everything, the protagonist's face distorted with horror. Driven mad by fear and anger, he didn't understand. Didn't the sister know what the consequences would be? At that moment, he grabbed her, and she tried to break free, determined to see the father immediately. But the brother shook her, determined that she shouldn't joke with him like that. Seeing them and filled with horror, the butler immediately ran to separate Cassius from his sister. Hugging the master with his hands, Jason began to apologize to Searia on his behalf. But the protagonist turned abruptly and struck the butler, pushing him aside. Not understanding why the protagonist was so obsessed with the past, Cassius quickly left the room. The butler wanted to run after him, but suddenly Searia called him. The girl wanted to know from him what mistake Cassius had made in the past. After waiting for his sister on the balcony for several minutes, the protagonist finally heard him call her. He didn't understand how he dared to leave furiously if they hadn't finished talking yet. From Jason, Searia learned what happened 10 years ago. One winter night, she and Nissus escaped to the frozen lake behind the palace, probably to play on the ice. However, the young master didn't want to live with Searia, and in fact didn't like her at all. So he left her alone in the night on the lake, angering their father. Cassius, the butler, and others headed there, desperate to find Searia. And the heir turned out to be the first to find the young woman, practically frozen to death. According to Cassius, he was afraid to show her to their father in that state so as not to attract even crueler punishment upon his brother. So he temporarily hid her, moving her so that Sari's face was over the lake ice. Suddenly, the ice in that spot cracked, and the protagonist ended up in the water. The butler was sure it was an accident, and the master simply made a mistake due to youth, without noticing the crack. However, those were Jason's words, but Sari's own memories returned to her. Cassius intentionally submerged her face in the water, trying to kill his own sister. It doesn't matter that he was young, as it didn't stop him from watching her drown, and if Jason hadn't arrived, he would have killed her like that. It also irritated Searia that Cassius continued to call her by her Keliden surname. Perhaps it was because he didn't want to erase her from the family tree, since she had become an archduchess. However, if she didn't have a title, would the brother want to dance with her? And would he even bother to answer her questions or say anything to her? Although she barely perceived the memories of the real Searia, the protagonist always had the feeling that she was being pushed into a dark lake and frozen. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't save herself. She couldn't even breathe. The feeling of imminent death constantly haunted her. But it turned out that they were really trying to kill her. Frightened by her words, Cassio decided to try to talk to her. But suddenly, he saw her start to lose consciousness. As she began to fall, she surprisingly ended up in the hands of Rush, who arrived at the right moment. He was the only person who saved her time and time again. Seeing her condition, the Archduke began to beg his wife to regain consciousness. He remembered that in their last meeting, she wanted him to come look for her at the Laurel's property. Because, according to Searia, if the Archduke appeared in person, everyone would be scared and it would be very funny. Moreover, it would be easier for the protagonist to endure the journey if she knew he was coming to look for her. He made the trip to take her, but he absolutely did not expect her to be in such a state. Lifting the protagonist and looking furiously at Cassius, the Archduke demanded explanations. What had they done to his wife? Later, Searia regained consciousness at the moment the Archduke was washing her feet. She didn't understand how he had arrived so quickly, since she didn't expect him to come in the next 3 days. However, the hero could no longer bear the separation, so he set off on his journey a little earlier. Seeing her bleeding feet from the shoes, Rush remembered asking her to be careful. But it seemed he hadn't succeeded. Searia apologized, and the Archduke decided that if she truly cared, she should tell him what Cassius did. The protagonist knew he wouldn't like that story, and besides, it had happened a long time ago. However, according to Rush, what happened on the Laurel estate was also a matter of the past. But Searia considered hers not that serious. The Archduke would probably also laugh that she wasn't able to solve such a small matter. But the fact was that Searia couldn't overcome her past, and for Rush this was very important. So, the heroine decided to tell him everything about what she had heard from the butler. After which, the Archduke's face contorted with anger and astonishment. Suddenly, the Marquise and her sons entered, joyfully greeting His Highness. While the mother kept praising the Archduke, News didn't understand why he knelt before Searia. Rush was pleased by their greeting, thinking that they precisely needed to discuss something. In the end, they ended up on the street, under the moonlight, next to a frozen pond. The Marquis didn't understand what was going on when, suddenly, the Archduke's glove flew towards his face. Rush hoped he had expressed himself clearly enough for someone so obtuse to understand his intentions. It was a duel challenge, after which the Archduke placed his hand on his sword. Cassius decided that, despite the hero's title, inviting someone to the lake was still excessive. He wanted to say something about Searia, but Rush interrupted him, denying him even mentioning his wife's name. The Archduke considered cutting the wretch's tongue off if he couldn't handle him. Then Cassius understood that, no matter what he said, the hero wouldn't stop being angry. Grabbing his sword, he decided to fight until Rush calmed down. But before he could unsheath his weapon, the Archduke suddenly appeared right in front of him. The hero brandished his sword and strongly struck the Marquis's face with the hilt. Falling to the ground, Cassius began to groan in pain and spit blood. Then Rush stepped on his foot, breaking a bone, which made Cassius scream. By making a small hole in the lake ice, the Archduke considered it enough. Grabbing the Marquis by the head, Rush wanted him to breathe well, as it wouldn't be interesting if Cassius died quickly. A second later, he plunged the Marquis's head directly into the water, causing him panic. Cassius always saw Searia as the stain on his family, and it irritated him that she carried the Calydon surname. Seeing how the maids dried her after the icy bath, he thought her presence was a mistake that would never be erased. However, he was surprised to see that she didn't even blink when she started to drown in that lake. First, the heir believed that his pride prevented him, since the heroine's blood was impure. Or perhaps she herself knows that no one will believe her, and telling what happened is useless. Convinced of this, Cassius believed that everyone didn't care and wished for Ceri's quick death. And now, for the first time, he felt his powerlessness, unable to escape Rush's grip. Suddenly, the Marquis's wife with her knight arrived, and Ceri along with Ebb. The Marquis's wife was terrified, while the heroine didn't understand what was happening. Before, the hero had promised that they would simply talk to Cassius, and Ceri fully believed him. But then, a commotion started on the street, and she decided to see what was happening. And what she saw turned out to be the most amazing spectacle of all. The Marquise grabbed the heroine by the cloak, demanding that she immediately calm her husband down. However, she didn't plan to intervene, since they were in a duel and she had no right to do so. Moreover, she didn't want to do anything that would surprise the lady anyway. Thinking she had lost her mind, the Marquise ordered her to kneel and begged the Archduke to stop acting. At that moment, the lady's knight caught the glove that almost hit the Marquise's face. Looking furiously at Abigail, the warrior didn't understand how she dared to treat his mistress like that. Burning with anger and thirst for revenge, Abby challenged her to a duel. Because for such treatment of the Archduchess, they would pay with their lives. Realizing that the warrior's patience was broken, Searia tried to stop her. But the Marquise's knight happily accepted the challenge, judging them extremely ignorant. But if the warrior is so determined, he hoped she wouldn't regret accepting it afterward. After defeating the commander of the Leiden House Knights in 3 seconds, Abby understood what this family valued in their fighters. The warrior waved her hand at her mistress and was glad to have finished so quickly. Seeing that her knight was easily defeated and that the prince had not freed his son, the Marquise lost consciousness. A short time later, sitting in her chambers, Searia spoke animatedly about it with Rush. In the end, the servants took the half-dead Kasia and the unconscious Marquise to provide them with aid. The protagonist hadn't felt such lightness in her heart in a long time. And the prince was not sure that it was enough, because if she had wished it, she would have killed him right there. Because if this guy had threatened the protagonist's life before, she wouldn't hesitate. In fact, if the prince decided how to act, he would have already declared war on the Leidens without hesitation. At that moment, the protagonist remembered his words that the past should only be lived. At that instant, she suddenly stopped caring about the situation, which left the hero paralyzed. Instead of accusing her or pretending everything was fine, Rush simply took her side. That's why he thanked her deeply for freeing her from the past. Responding with a smile, the hero decided that he had simply been delighted to help her. At that moment, the protagonist noticed for the first time the wrinkle on his face, which appeared when he smiled. Not realizing she had got close to him, Searia pretended she was just tired. She decided it was time to go to bed urgently, as she had to get up early tomorrow and prepare to go home. The next day, Searia personally approached her father to say goodbye before leaving. However, before that, the Marquis wanted to know what exactly Cassio had done yesterday. He absolutely did not want to deal with the consequences without knowing the situation. So, looking him straight in the eye, the protagonist decided to reveal the truth to him. Approximately 10 years ago, when she got lost, Cassius submerged his sister's head in the lake and held her there until she couldn't break free. Due to the shock of what he heard, the father didn't understand why he had kept silent all this time. Because he could have explained it when he arrived, and thus the Marquis wouldn't have seated them together. Now, he only wanted to hear from the protagonist why she hadn't said anything until now. So, the young woman pretended that, after the accident at the wedding ceremony, she had lost half of her memories. About what happened then, she learned it from Jason, which left the Marquis stunned. Looking at Searia with perplexity, he wondered if she had changed so much because of that. Considering this possible, the protagonist decided to clarify exactly when she was brought to this mansion. With his mind reeling from the sudden shock, the Marquis remembered that he was then approximately 3 or 4 years old. Looking at the portrait hanging on the wall, he saw that all family members appeared in it, except her. And that is despite the fact that she appeared when the protagonist was already here. Thanks to that, she herself verified that her father was no different from the rest of the family. Upon leaving, Searia hoped she wouldn't have to see them again. Closing the Marquis's office door, the girl sighed deeply. Hearing footsteps and turning around, she was very happy to see Rush. It turned out that the hero had come to personally accompany his beloved Archduchess. Meanwhile, upon learning from Jason that Kali's no longer wanted to talk to him, Cassius considered it a scandalous absurdity. The cause turned out to be that the Knights of House Burkov had accidentally told the servants what happened at the lake. But the Marquis didn't care, and he wanted the butler to resolve everything immediately. Until now, only Kali's knew. But if the rumor reached the aristocrats attending the banquet, it would be a catastrophe. Cassius didn't want anyone to know that he tried to kill Searia. And just then Nissus entered the room. Upon hearing his brother's words about trying to drown his half-sister, the hero stood motionless in astonishment. He was intrigued whether it was about what happened then, 10 years ago. Upon learning that it was not a coincidence, the gaze of the brother who suddenly decided to speak with honesty. According to Cassius, everything happened only because Nissus left her on the lake because she annoyed him. Terrified by his words, the hero began to justify himself, convinced that he had simply gotten lost trying to leave. He recalled that, upon becoming stellar, Cassius used his position for his own ends. The Marquise decided to defend her eldest son, thinking that Nissus, surely, was also trying to complicate her life. Moreover, what happened would severely affect her social standing. So it was urgent to think how to solve it. Upon starting to laugh hysterically, Nissus was stunned when he realized that he knew nothing. He hated Searia for distancing herself from her family and wanted to teach her a lesson. Only now did he understand how badly he had treated that girl for so many years. Now the hero understood that he, his mother, and his entire family were completely crazy. Ignoring his screams, Nissus ran desperately down the palace hallway. Later, Lennon ran to the frozen lake, eager to see the lady. In the end, he found her and thought that checking the ice every day after returning from the Kellans was a bit excessive. However, she considered that task an obligation she had neglected for a long time. The hero didn't understand why, upon seeing the Archduchess, he remembered students exhausted from so much work. She had just returned from a long trip, and Lennon wanted Searia to rest for a few days. Pointing to Abigail, he decided that the warrior undoubtedly had not yet recovered from exhaustion. But the warrior only moved her hands, not understanding how a knight could feel tired if the lady was nearby. Considering herself fresh as a daisy, Abby unsheathed her sword and resolutely set off to inspect the surroundings. Sometimes, at those moments, Searia doubted that her knight was human, which, personally, made Lennon happy. The heroine knew that, according to rumors, non-human races like mermaids and elves still existed, despite there being few of them. Raising an eyebrow, the hero remembered that he had come there for an important matter. It was his turn for a day off for the first time in a long time, so he wanted to have dinner with the Archduchess. Happy about the news, the heroine was about to give her consent. But suddenly, Lennon smiled strangely. It turned out he had simply remembered that they hadn't rested together in a long time. And such a dinner, according to Lennon, could end in different ways, which confused Searia even more. Looking away, she was sure that she had only been invited to eat together. In the evening, after another sip of wine, the glass fell from her hands and she could barely stay conscious. Seeing her, Rush was surprised that the heroine had gotten drunk so quickly. Trying to prove the opposite, the heroine decided to read the wine bottle label. She read the first 2 words easily, but then she started naming letters randomly. Hoping he wouldn't notice, Rush decided that enough was enough for today, but Searia continued to firmly claim she was sober. In her opinion, it was all because the wine was too delicious, and resisting was impossible. Moreover, Rush drank no less than her and clearly managed well. Seeing his smile, the girl didn't understand why he was laughing, since in reality he should already be drunker than her. She had only had a little compared to him, who almost emptied the bottle. But he was still sober. Rush decided that, come what may, he had to return the bottle to its place. Otherwise, it might fall. Suddenly, Searia looked at him suspiciously, with completely glassy eyes. Seeing that he was drinking and not getting drunk, she suddenly thought that his glass contained grape juice. Realizing she had said it out loud, the protagonist immediately tried to apologize. However, the Archduke decided to show it to the protagonist if she didn't believe him. Approaching Searia, he brought his glass to her face, determined that she should smell the contents. But unable to distinguish smells and not believing him, she suddenly grabbed it to drink. Due to the surprise, Rush's hand moved and the wine ended up on Searia's face. And also on his shirt. The protagonist apologized immediately, while the Archduke was happy that the glass hadn't broken. Seeing that his shirt was soaked with wine, Searia decided to take it off. Rutsch decided to go change, but the protagonist insisted, wishing to do it herself. While unbuttoning the buttons, she decided that she would wash it herself and return it in perfect condition. Grabbing her hands, the Archduke decided to try, once more, to make her understand that he was perfectly fine. Looking at him, Searia suddenly felt a feeling of attraction towards Rutchu within herself. The hero thought that if she didn't want to, he could stop by just saying one word to her. Understanding that the right thing to do would be to reject him, the heroine couldn't find the strength to do it. After a gentle kiss, the Archduke gently settled Searia back onto the table, bringing her closer to Sel. Touching his shirt with her hand, the heroine noticed it was damp and cold. Although he thought she was rejecting him, Rush didn't understand if she was doing it on purpose. The girl immediately pulled her hand back, convinced that he had an impression, while the hero looked at her with a smile. At that moment, Searia accidentally brushed against the wine bottle nearby with her hand and knocked it over onto the floor. Hearing the characteristic sound, the heroes looked surprised in the direction it came from. Seeing that the bottle had broken and the wine was spreading on the floor, Searia became very alarmed. Meanwhile, Rush decided that they wouldn't drink together anymore, which confused her even more. Moreover, he yearned with unusual intensity to obtain the approval of his marriage from the imperial family. The next day, upon learning that the knights had agreed to accompany her to pacify the monsters on the Corn's Plain, Searia became extremely enthusiastic. That was the land inherited by the heroine from her aunt, and, according to Lenin, the knights should thank her. The girl remembered that she planned to do many things there. Moreover, if they cleansed that land, they could secure the routes to the cave with the magic crystal. Happy with her impeccable plan, Searia physically noticed the Archduke's fixed gaze. Turning to Rush, she didn't understand why he was staring at her. The hero didn't understand what it was about, as he was just looking. But according to the girl, it lasted too long. It was uncomfortable for her that, since she entered his office, the Archduke hadn't stopped looking at her. After apologizing, the hero suddenly supposed that he was simply delighted by the beauty of his Archduchess. Not expecting to hear something like that, Searia blushed completely. And Lenin was surprised. He was intrigued by what had happened between them yesterday. But according to the heroine, it was nothing. Now, she herself had firmly decided not to get drunk anymore. She got up and immediately went to prepare the expedition, which surprised the Archduke. Searia thought that, instead of looking at her, Rausch should help her with the preparations. After a while, standing at the threshold of the Corn's lands, Searia heard Abby calling her. The knight considered it an honor to accompany the lady again, and the heroine was also happy to see her. Although the plain looked small on the map, in practice it felt enormous. Abigail heard from the knights that although the place was small, people dared not approach because monsters had settled there. Thinking that only brainless fools would venture onto those lands, the girls suddenly heard an alarm signal. It turned out that monsters attacked a cart that somehow reached there. Perceiving the young lady inside the cart, the creatures immediately surrounded her. Breaking the window, one of the monsters grabbed the lady, trying to pull her outside. The lady began to flail terrified inside the cart, but in the end ended up caught in the grip of a huge tentacle. Pulling the heroine out of the cart, 3 creatures prepared to tear her body to pieces. Suddenly the knights appeared, led by Searia, who knocked the monsters to the ground. Falling from the tentacle's grasp, the young woman threw herself down, but Searia managed to catch her in time. The lady immediately began to beg to be taken out of that place as soon as possible. Before completely losing consciousness, she suddenly thanked the saint for her rescue. Upon finding the heroine trying to bring the unknown woman to her senses, Abby hoped her mistress would be all right. Searia was unharmed, but assistance was needed for the wounded one who had been attacked by the beasts. Gently laying her on the ground, the heroine decided to try to purify her of the demonic energy. This was the first time she would cleanse someone with the necklace on, so Searia felt a little nervous. But as soon as she touched her, the demonic energy in her body instantly disappeared. Something surprising. The protagonist discovered that the knights were now scouring the plains, finishing off the remaining monsters while the Archduke headed north. Searia worried, as that was the most dangerous place, but Abby believed that the most dangerous one there was Rush. Moreover, the warrior became uneasy seeing how the land turned black at an incredible speed. However, after what happened, she verified that with that necklace, her divine power multiplied many times over. Upon starting the purification, she managed to cleanse the area around her, surprising Abby. The entire space around her, for hundreds of meters, became completely purified. She realized that it was precisely this necklace that purified the Laurel Palace. Now it was clear why in the book Lena wore this ornament without taking it off. Could someone who always depended on an external object be called a saint? Upon meeting them upon return, Lennon was sure that Searia and Abby were terribly tired from the journey. He was so happy about the owner's return that a few tears even escaped him. She suspected that the real reason for his joy was that he had managed to eliminate half of the demonic energy from the Corn's plane. The hero considered it truly amazing, thinking that they wouldn't even take weeks to start using those roads again. In reality, Searia planned to eliminate all demonic energy, but decided not to rush to test the limits of her own strength. Therefore, for now she didn't want to talk about the necklace, still unsure if it was precisely the one that appeared in the book. At that moment, the only thing the protagonist wanted was to go to her chambers and rest properly. Suddenly, she bumped into the Archduke, who was very happy to have finally found her. He hoped she had a free minute to discuss an important matter with him. It seemed to Searia that in a week he would calm down. But as soon as he appeared before her, she immediately remembered their dinner. The protagonist didn't understand what Rush intended by mentioning that they were awaiting approval of their marriage from the imperial family. Would anything change? Leaning towards her, the Archduke remembered that last time she got angry when he stared at her for a long time. However now, lost in her thoughts, Searia couldn't take her eyes off him. According to Rush, it was high time she admitted that her beauty had charmed him. If that was his urgent business, the young woman decided to continue on her way to her chambers. So the protagonist chose not to bother her anymore, as there was something truly important. The letter from the imperial palace finally arrived, and now their marriage was officially legitimized. Later, standing in Lars Duke's office, Suzette, Bastian, and Lennon couldn't contain their joy over the letter. The butler thought that the approval had come unexpectedly quickly, since it normally took at least a year. Lennon thought the emperor was simply afraid of getting involved with the Berkey. So the gardener reprimanded him, as that was an insult to the monarch. However, according to the hero, in those lands, only the lord and lady deserved respect. Something Suzette completely agreed with. Bastian decided to clarify how His Excellency planned to act now. Lennon guessed the answer to that question, as the night before he had witnessed the Archduke communicating it to His Excellency. Since their marriage was legitimate, he expected to travel with her to their capital residence. Bastian and Suzette were surprised, as the hero never traveled in winter. Not even with a direct order from the emperor himself, making excuses instantly. They concluded that only the Archduchess could influence him, so it was urgent to start reforms in the capital residence. Eager to know the exact date of the trip, the servants were perplexed to discover that Rush didn't know either. In fact, he wasn't even sure he could travel, which left them completely stunned. Lennon was more surprised than anyone, as he had heard with his own ears his proposal to travel to Her Excellency. However, that was only his wish, and Searia reacted very strangely. More fear than joy was reflected on her face upon receiving his invitation. Bowing her head, she forced a smile, convinced that the official recognition of the marriage was a positive thing. Later, Evie found Searia in a secluded spot, where she sat alone, downcast in thought. The protagonist was surprised to see the warrior devouring a roasted turkey leg. And it turned out she had stolen it from the kitchen. Evie wanted to congratulate her personally, as there was a festive atmosphere throughout the estate. And now Searia was officially an archduchess. However, this made the protagonist feel even more oppressed, and the knight decided to find out what was wrong. Since she had come precisely to offer her shoulder in case the lady needed to vent. Sighing heavily, the protagonist considered that it all came down to her only. and solely feared marriage. Until the day before, their marriage could be considered temporary, but now everything was different. And Searia hadn't thought the answer would come so soon. Thinking it was about Kali's, Abby concluded that her mistress couldn't forget that villain yet. Of course, she thought about him too, but not in the way the warrior imagined. She was afraid that Rush would treat her the same way Marquis Hennet did. Looking at her closely, Abby decided that the lady should wait a little for her and began to prepare for the trip. Seeing her taking out a knife, Searia got scared, not understanding where the warrior intended to go. Upon learning that she wanted to slit the Marquis's throat herself, the protagonist clung to her with her whole body, trying to stop her. Because if Abby really killed someone, the protagonist wouldn't be able to get her out of jail anymore. Looking at the lady with understanding, the knight now understood why she avoided her husband. It was so obvious that Rush had already suspected everything, especially with his ability to read minds. He remembered Lenin's indescribable enthusiasm when he learned about the Emperor's response alongside her. However, Searia knew that when Lena returned, she wouldn't be able to do anything, because despite all her efforts, the story's protagonist remained the same, and all her attempts to influence him were in vain. And if the man she married simply left with Lena, Searia didn't know what would happen to her. The protagonist thanked Abby for listening to her, but now she had to think things through carefully. Suddenly, Rush hugged her from behind, not understanding what she wanted to think about. He was perplexed again, not knowing what he had done to annoy the protagonist again. At least she could share it with him, so that the protagonist would at least know why to ask for forgiveness. Covering her face with her hand, Searia decided she was simply surprised by how quickly the Emperor's approval arrived. However, Rush didn't understand what difference there was between getting it now or in a year. For the protagonist, the difference was huge, because in a year, Lena would have already appeared. And the Archduke would surely have married her. She knew that sooner or later they would have to divorce, since their marriage was only temporary. Hearing talk of divorce, the Archduke was surprised, not understanding if she wanted to go back to that villain. Kali's. Searia didn't understand why he mentioned it, but Roch had no other reasons for divorce. He didn't want to hear anything about divorce, thinking he only needed the protagonist. And Searia decided it was because he was stubborn. The girl knew that her precious home needed her strength, so she wanted to fulfill her duties of inspecting the glacier with the greatest possible dedication. Rush was furious at her words, as she perfectly knew that wasn't what he meant. But the protagonist didn't understand what the problem was, clearly remembering how they got married, and that she lived with a sense of duty towards him. Rush wondered if she intended to leave after paying her debt. The girl believed that servants, having settled everything, could go wherever they wanted. Taking her hands, the Archduke didn't understand where else he could find a master who cared so much about a servant's emotions. Searia's feelings were of vital importance and constituted his main priority. On the other hand, he understood that she perhaps feared everything ending between them like it did with Kali's. The hero felt perplexed by her fear, as even the saint had disappeared. And now they were alone. Hearing that Lena could return at any moment, Rush wondered if the protagonist believed he might fall in love with the saint. In turn, Searia understood his anger, since even the Emperor had approved their marriage. And she kept mentioning divorce. Suddenly, focusing his gaze on the young woman, the Archduke realized it wasn't Marquis Hennet. Realizing this, the protagonist apologized, but Rausch wasn't interested in those. But that she was there. It didn't matter that she was engaged to another, nor that she was stern. The most important thing was that Searia was herself. Then, a question came to the hero's mind. Who was he to her, and how did she see him? The protagonist believed the Archduke was the novel's hero, whose love for the saint was the strongest in the world. He was also the one who married Lena, not the villain. However, Rush wanted her to look at the man who was right in front of her now. And he wished to know what Searia's heart felt at that moment, not another's. Deciding that she didn't know the answer to that question, tears suddenly began to stream down Searia's eyes. However, she was sure she didn't hate him, which was enough for him. Afterward, he stroked her cheek with the palm of his hand, and the Archduke melted into a kiss with his Archduchess. Sensing the cold emanating from her, he realized she was freezing and decided it would be better to go to a warmer place. A short time later, they showered together in hot water, embracing each other. Seeing her gaze, Rush hoped that at least now she wouldn't think about that wretch Marquis Jennett. However, Searia considered it impossible, as she was his wife. Honestly, even now her doubts about the Archduke hadn't disappeared. The thoughts that the saint would return and change everything still tormented her. But at that moment, she only felt the warmth of Rouge's body and saw the fire in his red eyes. Archduke Burke, who never existed in that story, was here now. Next to her, it was time to admit that he was not only the novel's hero, but the one who appreciated her the most. That is, Searia's husband. After some time, upon arriving at the Burke's capital palace, the heroine was amazed by the surroundings, which clearly differed from the Burke's lands. There was no piercing wind in any season, and spring truly seemed like spring. Although every structure was majestic and dazzling, Searia was uncomfortable that everything around her was deserted. Even though the size of the place did not concede ground to the imperial palace, it looked as if someone had looted it. According to Bastien, His Excellency spent most of his time on his property, which is why the residence in the capital looked abandoned. Just when she thought the lady could decorate everything to her liking, Searia set off immediately, determined that she was bored. However, the butler didn't want her to tire herself out and hoped the Archduchess would speak calmly with the master. While looking thoughtfully out of the large window of the building, the protagonist remembered that Rush would not be home for a few days. Still in the carriage, she didn't know that, in his absence from the capital, the Emperor had urgent matters with Rush. That's why the Archduke wanted Searia to go to the property for now, while he tried to arrive as soon as possible. Of course, he was embarrassed to send his wife alone, and the hero appreciated his understanding. The young woman noticed that lately the Archduke had been behaving very strangely. After showering together, he even started touching the heroine without warning. Returning to the house design, Searia decided to start with the lobby and suddenly found a portrait on the wall. It depicted a man who gave the impression of being fearsome. It turned out to be the ex-Archduke, along with his family. It was curious that Rush wasn't in the portrait, but the Archduke's illegitimate son was. Mitchell. Remembering the family portrait in her father's office, Searia understood that for the former Archduke. Only the male heir was never his family. Suddenly, she wished to remove that portrait, and Bastian was intrigued what the lady would hang there. It turned out she wanted to hang the picture that Marta sent from Loria there. Meanwhile, after finishing his main tasks, Rush sat in the conference room and reviewed a stack of documents. Linon thought the master had worked hard today and caused quite a commotion. Therefore, the hero hoped they would leave through the back doors so as not to run into the angry nobles. Linon showed him a map with the combat zones. The hero was surprised to discover that Rush had summoned all his knights who were helping in the fight against the creatures. It was probably because the Keliden lands were located near the west. Moreover, the Archduke refused to accept aid from Duke Howard against the creatures because he was friends with the Kelidens. All of this exasperated Linon, but Rush decided he could complain tomorrow, whereas tonight the married man had other occupations. Then he left indifferently, leaving his assistant completely perplexed. As soon as Rauch left the room, a group of nobles approached him angrily about his recent actions. Looking at them ironically, the hero thought those fools still didn't understand that all the power in House Burkov had passed to the Archduchess. Suddenly, Linon remembered something important and wondered why the master hadn't acted. He referred to the engagement rings, thinking that after receiving approval, Rush would immediately check all the jewelry stores. The Archduke believed that everything has its time, but the protagonist was simply intrigued. Recalling their wedding ceremony, Rush considered it was still too early for wedding rings.